Chapter 23 of The Lark by Miss Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Send in tea if I ring once," said Jane, preparing to face Mr. Rochester's mother in a crumpled blue print, with her hair very untidy and her hands deeply empurpled. Her dress was empurpled, too, because amid the bushes she had happened to kneel on a currant or two, but of this she was mercifully unaware. The carnation tint in her cheeks, induced by agitation, was very becoming, and she looked her prettiest. But she did not know this either. "Once for tea, Mrs. Doveton. Twice if I want you to let the lady out. At least, of course, Gladys must do that." "I'll be handy, miss, you may be sure," said Gladys enthusiastically. "I'll hang round like in the hall." "No, you won't, my gal," said Mrs. Doveton with some smartness. "I'll find you a job to do while you're waiting." "P'raps I'd better go back to the shop," Gladys tried. "You hear the drawing-room bell quite plainly there, and I dessay Mr. Herbert wouldn't mind staying to take over the shop when I was called away." "Mr. Herbert," said Mr. Herbert's mother, "will stay where he is, and you'll stay where you are. Don't you be flustered, Miss Jane. I dare say the old lady's quite mild, really. Them short-set men with tempers to match often have quite quiet mothers." "Don't make me laugh," said Jane, beginning to feel some sympathy with the giggles of Gladys. "You'll have tea already, won't you?" She was annoyed to find as she reached the drawing-room door that her heart seemed to have left its normal position just above where you tuck the rose into your belt, and to have shifted itself to less suitable quarters immediately under the short string of beads that encircles your throat. And annoyance changed to fury when she found that she was trembling all over. Had he written to his mother about her? Why should he have written? What could he have said? Why had she come? Why could she have come? To inspect? Why? To interfere? What with? To tell Miss Quested that young men's mothers didn't approve of unchaperoned days on rivers? To say what she thought of unchaperoned girls anyhow, and to take her boy away? Whatever she had come for, her coming would change things so that they could never be the same again. And Jane had to admit to herself that she did not want things changed. This wonder and these admissions all found time to be between her laying her hand on the knob of the door and her turning it. Then she did turn it and went in. The room seemed full of a dusky golden twilight. The flowers, she noted with relief, looked quite decent. Only the lupins had shed their petals all over the Sheraton card table in that aggravating way lupins have. Then she found herself laying her violet-tinted hand in a cool, gloved hand which seemed to expect it, and saying she was very pleased to see Mrs. Rochester, because this seemed to be the right thing to say. "Thank you so much," said the visitor in a thin, high voice. "That's very sweet of you. You see, I was in the neighborhood and I couldn't resist the temptation to call. I have heard so much of you from my son. You must know," she added with an elegant little simper, "you must know I'm a very devoted mother." "I'm afraid you're rather affected," said Jane, but not aloud. Aloud she said, "How nice," again because that seemed the best thing to say. "Ah, well, family affection involves great anxieties." "What are we coming to now?" Jane murmured. But the other did not pursue the theme of the affections, family or otherwise. "What a delightful old-world spot this is," she said. "So quaint and picturesque. It has all the lure of the bygone, has it not?" "I'm glad you think so," said Jane politely, but in her heart she was saying, "I wonder whether you always talk like the woman's page in the Daily Yell. How awful for him if you do. I suppose you live quite an idyllic life here, surrounded by friends and relations. No anxieties?" "Not at all, thank you," said Jane. "No, of course not. At your age life is a garden of roses, is it not? But what I really wanted to talk to you about was a little private matter between us two." The thin voice went on with a detestable archness. "And I needn't apologize for bringing it up, need I? for I'm sure it's a subject in which you take an interest. Young people, you know. So sympathetic. Now tell me candidly, and don't be afraid of offending me, dear. Don't you think he's wasting his time? Just the least in the world? Who? Jane felt obliged to ask. Why, my boy. Don't you think he's wasting his time just a wee bit? Jane, heavy with astonishment and impotent rage, could only say she supposed his mother knew best. Oh, no. A delicately gloved but intolerably waggish forefinger was shaken in Jane's face. She would have liked to bite it. Oh, no, you can judge far better than I can. You have so many more opportunities of seeing, my dear boy. Jane ventured to suppose that Mr. Rochester knew his own business best. Oh, no, the voice was too thin for cooing, but it tried to coo. Young men never know best. Never. We have to think for them, we poor, weak women. He has his way to make in the world, and— Well, let him make it, said Jane, suddenly aware that her temper was going, and feeling that it was almost time it did go. Ah, but the white hands on the bridle rein. 2 charming girls, quite charming, I'm sure. From a child my son John was so susceptible, almost painfully susceptible. What? Cried Jane in quite a new voice. Susceptible, said the other, quailing a little. Nonsense, said Jane loudly, and she leapt from her chair and with one purposeful jerk she pulled up a blind. Then, with the intent ferocity of a well-bred bulldog in a good way of business, she approached the visitor, who retreated with some activity, but in vain. Jane pursued her, caught her by the console table, took her by the shoulders and shook her. "You beast," she said vehemently, "you absolute beast." It was a strange scene, a scene such as that sober drawing-room had perhaps never witnessed. The shrinking figure of an elderly lady being thoroughly and systematically shaken by a small, slim girl with flame on her cheeks and daggers in her eyes. It was almost a pity that such a scene should have had no spectators. So evidently it appeared to the fates, for they remedied the oversight by permitting Gladys to escape from Mrs. Doveton and enjoy the spectacle to the full through the crack of the library door. "You beast, you little beast," Jane repeated, and then Mrs. Rochester's bonnet fell off and Mrs. Rochester's hair came down. And it was Lucilla that Jane was shaking. Lucilla, half laughing through the little wrinkles that were now so plainly only grease paint, and begging for mercy in the voice that was her own. "Don't, Jane, don't. You're choking me." "I should hope so," said Jane, and went on shaking. "Didn't she do it lovely?" Gladys permitted herself to say, opening the door widely enough for that purpose. Jane stopped shaking Lucilla. "Have you been listening at the door?" she asked, turning like a whirlwind. "Because if you have—" "Of course not, miss," said Gladys, deeply injured. "But when I heard the blind click, Mrs. Doveton heard it too. We was both in the kitchen. I knew it was all up, and I come to help Miss Lucy off with her things. It was as good as a play when she went outside and rang the bell, and me inside ready to open, and she says, 'Miss Quested at home?' and says she'd seen the advertisement and she wished to recommend a cook. Nobody could have known her." Jane's face cleared a little at this evidence that at least Lucilla had retained some vestiges of tact. She caught at her self-possession. "Well, you needn't wait, Gladys," she said. "The fun's over now. Yes, it was very amusing." She made herself laugh, and reflected that she would have to laugh sooner or later, and might as well begin now and laugh generously. She laughed again, with more sincerity. "I'll help Miss Lucy to undress," she said. "Yes, it was jolly good. It quite took me in. It was a right down regular do, and a thorough lark." "Yes, wasn't it?" said Gladys. "Miss Lucy ought to be on the halls." "All right, miss, all right. I'm off." "It was a fair score," said Jane, folding up the silk dress that the false Mrs. Rochester had worn. "You were absolutely it. You took me in completely. Your voice was splendid. About an octave above your natural voice, wasn't it?" and that affected little laugh, like a neigh. You're a born actress, Lucilla. Gladys is quite right. There was something about the voice that seemed familiar, but I thought our Mr. Rochester's voice perhaps was like his mother's." "It isn't a bit like that voice," said Lucilla, spluttering among warm soapsuds. "It was a nice voice, wasn't it? Whatever made you think of doing it?" "The rubbish you were talking about chaperones, I expect. I thought I'd call and offer myself as one. Then I thought I'd pretend to be a potential pig. And when Gladys said, 'What name?' she acted all right, too, except for giggling. I could think of nothing but Rochester. I thought you'd see through me directly. It was Gladys who thought of pulling down the blinds. I never expected to say more than 'How do you do?' before you recognized me. I couldn't have kept it up much longer. I couldn't think of anything to say. You thought of a good deal." "Oh, that wash," said Lucilla, throwing back her hair, and Jane felt somehow solaced. "But what was it that gave me away?" Lucilla asked. "My son John," Jane told her. "He told me one day that his mother always calls him Jack. I gather that she thinks John rather, what's the word, roturier. So then I knew something was up, and in a flash I saw that you weren't real. Do you know, that was a horrid moment when you began to come to pieces in my hands. I almost expected you to be nothing but clothes, like that ghastly nun in Villette." "I rather expected to be torn to bits myself," said Lucilla. "You were violent, Jane." "What did you expect? Though she is little, she is very fierce." "Well, it was a good rag," said Lucilla contentedly. "Only my head doesn't feel quite safe on my shoulders yet." "I think I was very moderate," said Jane. Next day the cooks came, but none of them suited Mrs. Doveton. "I shouldn't care to trust e'er a one of them to do for you," she said, and a wonderful tremulous hope sprang up in the breasts of the girls that perhaps Mrs. Doveton herself, always so averse from responsibility, and now so delicately placed as the arbiter of their domestic destiny, might find herself unable to take upon herself the burden of decision, that she might in fact, rather than risk the selection of an unsuitable, continue to do for them herself. The paying guests whose letters had been approved, and who had been asked to call, did call. Lucilla interviewed them. "It's the least you can do," said Jane. "I couldn't face a caller now. I should be afraid it would turn out to be you. But I shall be there with you, you know." "So you say," said Jane darkly. "I'm not going to risk it. You're capable of being yourself and someone else at the same time. You're quite equivalent, as Gladys would say. I shall sit in our boudoir and bood, or read. And I shall wash my hair, so that it won't be any use your sending Forbes up to say that, 'Please'm, Miss Cray would like to speak to you a moment in the drawing-room.' My hair will be wringing wet the whole time they're here." When it came to the point, Jane did not wash her hair, because a 4 at tennis had been arranged to take place directly after tea, but she sat with the hair thoroughly down over a kimono with storks on it, and thus defended, heard 3 times the resonant ringing voice of the front door bell, announcing, "There are strangers on your doorstep who don't know how I reverberate and clang, and how I keep it up unless you ring me very, very gently." But only twice did she hear the tinkle of the drawing-room bell, a mincing tinkle, reminding one of the voice of the false Mrs. Rochester, and saying, "There are visitors being shown out of your high-class family mansion by your irreproachable white-aproned, long streamer-capped parlour-maid." By a simple arithmetical process, she was being led to conjecture that one of the callers might have had to ring twice, though Forbes was so very irreproachable that this was not likely. When she heard Lucilla's voice in the hall, the voice of one pleasantly elated in the company of congenial spirits. "No trouble at all," she was saying. "Of course I'll go with you to the gate." And then, "And wouldn't you like to go round the garden?" A woman's pleasant voice answered her, and men's voices joined it. Jane ran through to the window of one of the unoccupied rooms that looked over the cedar lawn. Lucilla was crossing it in the company of a very elegant-looking young woman and 2 young men, who, if not exactly elegant, were certainly presentable. They disappeared beyond the lawn, and Jane hurried back to her room to do her hair and go down to meet the strangers. Why, she told herself, they look quite nice, not like PGs, like real people. And she hastened to exchange the kimono for a frock and her gold-embroidered slippers for sedate suede shoes. But before she had come to the shoes, Lucilla burst in upon her. "Oh, my dear," she said, "such luck. They've taken the rooms, the 3 best bedrooms and a sitting room. We can easily turn one of the bedrooms into a sitting room, and that attic where the cistern is for a dark room. They go in for photography. They're going to have a tap and sink put in. They pay for it. They're musicians, too. They play at concerts. They're going to pay 3 guineas a week each, and 3 for the sitting room, and 2 for the dark room. That's 14 guineas a week, my girl. We'll have to be a bit more careful about their references. A bit more careful than last time, I mean. They've given me 3. A clergyman, and their last landlord, and their bank. We must call on these references. Where have they been living? In Carlisle. That's convenient. Ah, but their bank's in Lombard Street, and we'll go and call on that. No writing. We'll see with our own eyes whether Barclay's Bank is a real bank. Oh, Jane, what luck! They're nice, then? I should jolly well think so. Why, Jane, they're not a bit like PGs. They're just like people, you know. And Mr. Tombs, what about him? Oh, he came, and he's taken the top tower bedroom. He's not bad either. Tall, thin, middle-aged, nice face, and a nice voice if he'd use it. Blue glasses. He's got references, too. Upper Tooting. We can go there, you know. And what's he paying? Oh, 3 guineas, the same as the others. For that horrid poky little room? Oh, well, we can't make these distinctions. He seemed quite satisfied. And if he's no other good, he'll do for a chaperone. Drop it, said Jane. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "I feel as if we were being whirled along in a what-do-you-call-it," said Jane. "Motor car?" suggested Lucilla, her speech obstructed by pins. "No, maelstrom," said Jane. "Things do keep happening so. Don't put in so many pins, Luce. I can see how it goes all right." They were occupied in covering 2 easy chairs with bright chintz. I am sorry to say that they had cut up a pair of curtains 12 feet long by 6 feet wide so as to avoid the extravagance of buying new cretonne to brighten the sitting room which they were arranging for their new guests. The curtains were beautiful, with purple birds and pink peonies and pagodas of just the right shade of yellow to be worthy to associate with the pinks and the purples. The curtains were lined and bordered with faded rose-colored Chinese silk, and pounds could not have bought their like. Shillings, on the other hand, and not so very many of them either, could have bought the cretonne. Pity, but do not despise these inexperienced housekeepers. They did not know. How should they? Even the most charming girls do not know everything. There was a girl once who cut up a fine hand-woven linen sheet to line a dress with and thought she was being economical. But that is another and a sadder story. "Well, we want things to happen, don't we?" said Lucilla. "Wasn't it rather the idea that we should live a strenuous life full of hard work and earn our livings with the sweat of—" "That pinky silk would look lovely under a bluey-purply sort of crepe de chine. There'd be plenty of it for us each to have a dress. That would be something happening." "Yes, your Aunt Lucy did certainly have the loveliest things. These curtains must have come from a much bigger house than the cottage. And I don't call a new dress things happening. Things that you do to yourself aren't things happening. It's things other people do. Those loathsome PGs that didn't pay, and Mrs. Dadd, and you being Mrs. Rochester. That doesn't count. It wasn't real. Quite real enough, thank you, and now everything turned upside down to get this room ready for these horrid people. They're nice people, Lucilla insisted. I don't care how nice they are, they come upsetting things. With £14 a week? Guineas, said Jane absently. Do you know, Luce, I think there's something to be said for the sheltered life. We had a little taste of it just that week or two after the pigs bolted. That's the life Emmy has, always. No anxieties, just time to be jolly and enjoy herself. If that's what you feel, you'd better go and be a seraglio at once. Nonsense. And I'm not saying what I mean. Did you ever notice how sometimes you don't? I think what I really mean is that I don't want strangers about, however nice they are. And I mayn't think they're nice either. Hold that corner steady and I'll stitch it now and have done with it, and we'll nail up the untidy edges underneath. I wish you'd rein in your wandering mind and tell me what's happened. Oh, nothing, said Jane, and stopped short suddenly. Only Forbes says she didn't understand it was to be a boarding house. And Mrs. Doveton says we ought to keep accounts, and Mr. Dix says we ought to keep bees, and he wants us to have pigs and a cow, and we haven't the least idea how much anything costs, or how much it ought to cost. And 17 guineas a week looks lovely, but if you don't know how much you're spending, you can't tell where you are. We may be barging along the road to ruin for anything we can tell. And I don't suppose these rooms will be ready by the time these people come. And Mrs. Doveton says we ought to have in our sugar by the hundredweight, wholesale. And the drawing-room chimney wants sweeping, and we keep on saying we'll get the silver up from behind the garden-room stove, and we never do. Did you hear of people biting off more than they can chew? There's nothing in all that, said Lucilla, busy with snipping scissors. Everything's going on all right. But I'll tell you what, Jane, if you begin to turn coward, everything won't go on all right much longer. This place is too big, said Jane. It eats up all one's courage. But we wanted a big place to earn our livings in, and we got it, by a miracle. I know we agreed that we wouldn't tell each other not to be silly, but really— Every word you say is true, said Jane, every single word. And I'm an idiot, but there's Mr. Dix going on like an intelligent steam engine, and Mrs. Doveton like— All right, I'll drop it. Let's talk of something else. Is that Thornton girl good-looking? Girl, returned Lucilla. She's married to one of them. I don't know which. I must have told you that a dozen times. Never, said Jane. You said the tall one was her brother, but not a word about her being married to the other one. I thought they were all brothers and sisters. Hurry up, let's get these chairs done and go out and see the fountain. Mr. Rochester's made it work, but I told him not to turn it on till we came out. She fell to work with renewed courage. What was it you were asking about the Thornton girl? Just before I said she wasn't a girl. What was it? Oh, I don't know, said Jane blithely. It doesn't matter anyhow. Now let's fix our powerful minds on bees. Shall we have them or shan't we? Can we afford it? Oh yes, said Jane, if our Mr. Dix says so. He knows about it all. He knows. That'll turn out all right. Don't you worry. And variable as the shade by the light quivering aspen made, said Lucilla. Yes, I know, said Jane. Yes, I was in the dumps, but you're a splendid comforter, Luce. I see that you're right and everything's all right. And you are right. And I am right. And everything is quite correct. Lucilla's scissors snipped in a thoughtful silence. But to herself she said, "Oh ho," and remained thoughtful in the face of the sudden bright gaiety with which Jane now enlivened their work. The afternoon was fine, the fountain played to admiration, and Mr. Rochester received the congratulations of the company. Mr. Dix received permission to buy bees. Jane seemed to have received a new lease of her habitual light-hearted optimism, and Lucilla felt that she had received enlightenment. It was Mr. Rochester's day of triumph, for after the fountain had sprung and sparkled and pretended to be in turn cotton wool and glass and fine silver, he announced that the library was done, and they trooped along to see it. The too enthusiastic interest of Gladys had led Mr. Rochester to ask leave to keep the door locked. So it was some time since anyone but Rochester had entered the room. Now they all stood in a silence of admiration that followed the first involuntary and unanimous "Oh!" For all the mustard-coloured paint was gone, and the panels showed in the beautiful grey of their own oak. The books had been dusted and put back on the shelves, and the room had been swept and brushed to a fine bare neatness. "Why, it's the most beautiful room in the house," said Lucilla. "Almost it persuades me to be a bookworm," said Dix, and took down a book and then another book. Lucilla also began to take down books, large ones with pictures. In a moment she looked round for someone to share the delights of a book of engravings, romantic pictures of castles and monasteries and ruins, with the wonderful trees and skies of the steel engraver and the little blurred round brown footprints of time. "Oh, do look at this picture of Lindisfarne. Isn't it lovely?" And Mr. Dix came and looked and said it was. "But look at this," he said, displaying his book, "the lovely little pictures of strange beasts." Jane and Rochester drifted to the window, whose big bow made almost another room. An octagonal table, leather-covered, came near to filling it. They squeezed past, and leaned out of the casement among the thick-flowered jasmine and wisteria. When I say they drifted, I do not really mean what I say. To Lucilla and Dix they no doubt appeared to drift, but what really drew her to the window was the action of Mr. Rochester. He too had taken a book from the shelf and had held it out for Jane's inspection, and when she looked it wasn't a rare edition or a picture of a manticora or a ruined abbey that she beheld, but a slip of paper on which was written, "Please come to the window. I have something secret to tell you." Now you must know that during the last few weeks Jane, by an art so consummate as almost to have deserved from an unkind critic the epithet of artfulness, had succeeded in being very nice indeed to Mr. Rochester in public, and at the same time had most resolutely avoided all occasions of converse with him except public ones. Rochester, with equal art but inferior success, had tried his hardest to get a word alone with her, in vain. Always she was with Lucilla, with Mrs. Doveton, with Gladys, with one of the dismal and non-paying guests. And if he did find her alone, she was always on her way to keep a most urgent appointment with one or other of her unconscious chaperones. Lucilla, who had herself no desire for tete-a-tetes, had seconded Jane ably, if unconsciously. And this had gone on and on. Now Jane looked at the book and said, "Yes, very pretty," and very, very slightly shook her head. "Oh, but look at this," said Rochester, turning the pages quickly. She looked, and this is what she read. "There is a secret door. Let me show it you first." Oh well, if it was only a secret door. And it was then that she moved slowly towards the window, Rochester following with an admirably simulated air of its being a moment this like any other moment. "That's very good of you," he said, in that veiled voice which sounds just like ordinary talking to anyone a couple of yards away, until he tries to hear what you're saying and finds that he can't. "And there is a secret door. But first I want to ask whether I may go on using this room. I am writing a book about my new discovery." "Oh," said Jane, and her voice was not quite so veiled as his, but still, she wasn't exactly shouting. "Have you made a new discovery? What is it?" Well, he said, if it's what I think it is, and I don't think I'm wrong, it knocks spots off Newton. And as for Einstein, but that's all dull to you. You mean I couldn't understand it? You could, of course, but you'd have to understand a lot of other dull things first. Mathematics and physics and dynamics and things like that. Can't you explain in a popular style that the beaver could well understand? I suppose I could, but it would take a long time and it wouldn't amuse you. Only may I come and write here? It's so quiet and so good, and I wouldn't be in the way. I'd go in and out through the French window. And the secret door? Well, I shall always be here, and when you feel you'd like to see it, well, here it is, you know. But I can't have secrets from Luce about secret doors, you know, she added hastily. Forgive me for saying that. I can. Please let me, he pleaded. Let me have just this one little secret with you. Oh, very well, Jane mumbled, anxious to get away from any talk of secrets, especially from the memory of another secret that he had with her. The little secret of their last interview in that room when... Jane looked at his coat. It was the same coat, and wondered how any fabric worn by men could be at once so coarse and so comforting. All the same... But I thought, she said, picking jasmine flowers and laying the stalks together with earnest accuracy, I thought you were to take care of your uncle's house till he came back. Oh, that's all off. My uncle met a chap in Paris and he's lent him his house. He's got a lot of 16th and 17th century books, you know, and this man's got some wonderful cipher he's finding out, and his health won't let him live in London near the British Museum. And of course these books are a godsend. You see, this cipher is really rather a wonderful thing, so my uncle says, and... But tell me, said Jane, who, like most normal human beings, was deeply uninterested in ciphers, where are you going to live? Well, that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. Jane wondered how she could have ever thought he wanted to talk about anything else. About their last talk in that room, for instance. She could have slapped herself for that refusing shake of the head. What could he think of her? Why should she have refused to come to the window to be told about where Mr. Rochester was going to live? You see, he went on, it's much easier to say no if there's no audience, and I thought if I asked you coram populo you wouldn't perhaps like to say no, even if you meant it. No to what? To Dix's idea that I should share his cottage. Do you mind? No, why on earth should I? Then that's all right, he said joyously. And we're friends again, aren't we? We've never been anything else, she said, sticking the jasmine in the front of her dress. Mayn't I have some? He asked, and really it would have been silly and self-conscious and schoolgirlish to tell him to pick a piece for himself. So she gave him a sprig of jasmine and he put it in his coat. Then I'll move my traps down tomorrow, he said. It's really very good of you. Jane reminded him that the whole place was his uncle's. And besides, she said, isn't it better for Mr. Dix? Isn't it cheaper to keep house for two than for one? She asked. Not quite that, perhaps, he said gravely, though his eyes were smiling. But 2 people together cost less than 2 apart, I'm told. I suppose they eat up each other's crusts. And look here, Dix and I were wondering, couldn't we have another day on the river before those new people of yours come? I wish you didn't have them. You ought to have the place to yourself and not be obliged to... And not be obliged to turn pigs loose into it? Well, it isn't our place, you know. And I think how lucky we are to have a place at all to turn pigs into. I wish you hadn't to do it. You'd like us to sit on a cushion and sew a silk seam? I'm afraid the strawberries are over for this year, he said. But, oh well, let's make the best of it. Miss Cray says they're really nice people, these new pigs of yours. We could get up a little dance." "Oh," said Jane, new vistas opening before her. "May I implore the honour of the first dance?" "All right," said Jane. There was certainly no reason for saying, "No, thank you." And that night she and Lucilla talked long and earnestly of the lovely possibilities of rose-coloured Chinese silk and chiffon and all the shades of the fairy rainbow, the shades that you can never match in the shops. It was the day before the one fixed for the arrival of the Thorntons and Mr. Tombs. The rooms were ready, the armchairs looked beautiful, and Jane was enjoying a well-earned rest in the hammock that hung from the apple tree on the remotest of all the lawns, when she saw through the bushes the uncompromising black and white livery of Forbes approaching like a large respectable magpie. Whatever is it now, Jane wondered. She was deep in Uncle Silas and wished for invisibility. Forbes very properly waited till she was quite close to her young mistress before announcing that there was a lady to see her. "Tell Miss Cray," said Jane. "I can't see anyone." Forbes said that Miss Cray was out, she believed, ma'am. "Oh, all right." Jane plunged angrily out of the hammock. "I'll come. I suppose you've put her in the drawing-room. Who is it? Did she give her name?" "Yes, ma'am. It's Mrs. Rochester," said Forbes, and something faintly resembling a smile seemed to play near her mouth. "Mrs. Rochester? And Lucilla not in? And Forbes, the gravest of the grave, almost smiling? This was a little bit too much. Once was all right and not a bad joke, but twice? And with John Rochester working in the house too? Lucilla ought to know better." Jane quickened her pace to a run. She had shaken Lucilla last time. This time... She ran on, arrived in the hall flushed and dishevelled, glanced through the crack in the drawing-room door. Yes, there she was, close to the door from the library. Jane crept quietly through the room where John Rochester was today fortunately not working, came behind the seated figure and smote it violently on the back, crying, "Oh, no, you don't, old girl." And her hands were raised to tear off Lucilla's disguise, not a bonnet this time, but a hat, and quite a smart one, when the smitten figure, having risen, turned, staggering, revealing to the stricken Jane the infuriated countenance of a perfect stranger. This time it really was Mrs. Rochester. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Many of my readers are no doubt familiar with the tremendous timidities, the doubtful diffidences, the agitation, the soul-searching with which a young woman prepares for the first meeting with his mother. And this even if he be merely an agreeable acquaintance who might possibly be suspected of harbouring sentiments a little beyond those involved in mere acquaintanceship. You will have noticed how the heart beats, how the hands tremble, how long it takes to decide on the right frock, and how impossible it is to do the hair decently. You know how desirous you are that she should like you, and how determined you are that you will like her, and how, as the moment of meeting approaches, and when it is beyond doubt too late to make any change, you wish wretchedly that you had chosen another frock and done your hair a different way. You know how you wish that your hands were not at once warm and clammy, and how you wonder whether she can see your heart beating like a steam hammer under your thin best jumper. These nerve-wracking experiences Jane was spared, and besides, of course, Mr. Rochester was nothing to her, or at any rate only a friend. And she had been spared the torments of nervous anticipation. On the other hand, Mr. Rochester was a friend, and she would have liked to be decent to his mother, instead of which she had thumped his mother on the back and called her old girl and said, "No, you don't." What was Jane to do? What would you have done? What Jane said was, "Oh, I am so sorry," There's a looking-glass just behind you." For Mrs. Rochester had put both hands up to her hat, which had been shaken from its exquisite calculated poise by the sudden and violent impact of Jane's little paw on the shoulder of the hat's wearer. Mrs. Rochester mechanically turned to the looking-glass, a pretty oval empire thing in whose frame doves and cupids fought it out amid endless loops of carved and gilded ribbon. "I am most frightfully sorry," Jane went on. "You must think I'm quite mad, but I'm not really. I thought you were my friend, dressed up." A silence. Mrs. Rochester's fingers were busy with the hat. Elegant, half diaphanous, lacy, with floating veil of grey and perfectly placed pink and grey velvet pansies. Jane noticed this, and noticed anew the gilded birds and boys. Also, she noted in the mirror the pretty, faded, furious, powdered face of her visitor. "Do please forgive me," said Jane again. "I thought it was my friend. She dressed up once before and pretended to be a lady." "Your friend is not a lady, then?" was Mrs. Rochester's first word. Jane resisted the old Adam and went on meekly. "I mean she pretended to be a strange lady come to call. I thought it was her again, dressed up." "Do I look like a person dressed up and pretending to be a lady?" Mrs. Rochester asked, flashing the front view of her perfectly dressed self on the cringing Jane. "You look absolutely lovely," said poor Jane quickly. "But I saw only the back of you, and I just thought how clever of Lucilla to get up like that, so different from the last time when she dressed up. She was dowdy and old then, and she quite took me in. I'd not the least idea it wasn't Lucilla." "Your maid didn't tell you my name then?" "Oh, she said something, but I didn't pay much attention. I was so sure it was Lucilla," said Jane, perceiving new pitfalls on every hand and wondering whether she would be forced into downright lying. "Do please try to forgive me. I do hope I didn't hurt you. I feel like a bull in a china shop when I think— oh, how could I? Do sit down and try to forgive me for being such a blundering idiot." Perhaps Mrs. Rochester was softened by Jane's appeals. Perhaps the wisdom of the dove had not quite deserted Miss Quested in this her hour of need. Perhaps John Rochester's mother felt that in this clumsy hoyden behaving, as the hoyden herself admitted, like a bull in a china shop, Miss Antrobus had not the serious rival she had feared. This girl at any rate was no siren, just a blousy, blundering schoolgirl. However it may have been, Mrs. Rochester smiled, a neat, mechanical smile, performed by the lips alone, wholly unassisted by the eyes, and said, "Please don't apologize any more. I quite understand. Just a youthful frolic." She seated herself with a perfect grace, and Jane, standing before her, felt like a whipped puppy. "Do sit down too, won't you?" said the lady in grey silk and violet embroideries, and Jane sat. Her frock was crumpled and crushed from the hammock, and her hair in a pigtail. She looked about 14. No, certainly not a siren. "You must wonder at my descending on you in this way," Mrs. Rochester went on. "But your friend Lady Hesketh, we were neighbours in the country, wrote to me that you were desirous of entertaining paying guests. Yes?" "Yes," said Jane, wishing that her hands were clean, or alternatively that she had never been born. "I asked Emmy to ask everyone she knew. Emmy, Lady Hesketh, you know." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Rochester, looking about her through the most impertinent tortoise-shell-framed lorgnettes. "What a charming old-world place this is it not?" "Yes," said Jane, rendering heartfelt tribute to Lucilla's instinct, and found herself continuing. "It has all the lure of the bygone, hasn't it?" "Are you a fool, or are you being clever?" Mrs. Rochester mused. Aloud she said something vague about the beauties of old gardens, to which Jane alertly responded by something still vaguer about the beauties of nature. "So nice, isn't it?" she found herself saying. "Old trees and lawns and things, so quaint." The talk stagnated in this backwater for some time. It was Mrs. Rochester, Jane was determined that it should be, who moved back to the mainstream. "But I mustn't forget the object of my visit in your delightful conversation," she said. Most unfairly, Jane thought. "We really must talk business, mustn't we?" If Jane hadn't seen the real Mrs. Rochester in the looking-glass, she might have believed in that tone of gentle camaraderie. As it was, she answered coldly. "Yes, about the P.G.'s. Paying guests, I mean. Our terms are 5 guineas a week, and we haven't any rooms except on the second floor." "You have other guests, then?" "Yes?" "Yes, several," said Jane. "The young friend I am making these enquiries for is a Miss Antrobus, a very charming girl. She is coming to London to study something. Now, what is it? Art? Music? Oh no, I remember, it's political economy. And it wouldn't suit her health to be right in London. So it seemed as though this would be quite ideal. Thank you so much for the information you have given me, and for our delightful chat. And now I think I had better see your mother." "My mother," said Jane steadily, "is dead." "Well, your aunt, then, or your cousin, or whoever it is that chaperones you." "Would my great-aunt do?" said Jane, suddenly making up her mind. "Certainly." "Well, I don't think she's at home today, but you can see her tomorrow if you really feel it's necessary to see her. Really, I can tell you anything you want to know." I wish I'd said 6 guineas. That might have choked her off. "Could I not see her if I called this evening, say at 9? I shall be dining with my son. We could come round after dinner, yes?" "That will do perfectly," said Jane, rising with much the air of a duchess ending an interview with a dressmaker. She knew better, but also she heard a movement in the library which told her that Mr. Rochester had returned. "I'll see you out this way," she went on very quickly. "I'll tell my aunt, and I'm sure she will be very pleased. But she's an old lady and rather deaf. Mind the step. Yes, it's a beautiful day. It's been a lovely summer. Thank goodness I've got you out of the drawing-room." "Oh no, it's no trouble. I should love to see you to the gate. Aren't the evergreen oaks a nice shape?" "Yes, my aunt will be sure to be in this evening. Goodbye." Jane, having watched the trim grey figure out of sight, ran like a rabbit to the library. "You've come to hear the secret?" cried Rochester, jumping up. "Oh, nonsense," said Jane. "Look here, the most awful thing's happened. No, don't look like that. Nobody's dead yet, but your mother has been here." "My mother?" "Yes, she came to see about a Miss Antrobus coming as a P.G. "Miss Antrobus?" "Don't," said Jane. And I am sorry to record that she stamped her foot. "For goodness sake, don't keep repeating everything I say. Your mother called, and I thought she was Lucilla dressed up, and I crept up behind her and clumped her on the back and said—" "What did you say?" "I said, 'Oh, no, you don't, old girl.' Just like that. Oh, don't laugh. Don't." But Rochester had to, and when he laughed thoroughly. Jane looked at him with suppressed fury, but suddenly something in her seemed to give way, and the next moment she too was laughing. And laughing, she felt, with far too much heartiness and abandon. Mr. Rochester, she was convinced, would not like her, not really like her, to be laughing at a scene, however comic, in which his mother had been assaulted and battered. And how was Jane to explain to him that it had been just a toss-up whether she should laugh or cry? "Oh, don't," she said at last. "You oughtn't to laugh, and I'm sure I oughtn't. I behaved like a bull in a china shop, and your mother so sweet and gentle." "Jane?" "And besides, there's no time to laugh. I want you to do something for me." "Anything," he said, wiping his eyes. "You said we were friends," said Jane. "I can't explain now because your mother's gone down to your uncle's house looking for you. But do you mind telling her, if she asks you, that we have a great aunt living with us, Aunt Harriet, I think. An old lady, rather deaf. I don't want you to say so unless you're asked, you know. Oh, how awful everything is. Now I'm asking you to tell lies to your own mother." "I don't mind," he said truthfully. "And look here, don't you worry. I believe one has a perfect right to tell lies if people ask questions they've no right to ask." "I'm sure that's wrong," she said, "but I can't argue. You must fly after your mother and head her off, or she'll be coming back to look for you here. But before you go, you must tell me where to go to get wigs and things." He named Hugo's. "But look here," he said, "I don't want to ask any questions, but don't do anything that'll be difficult to keep up." To wring the hands is not usual off the stage, but Jane came near it. "I can't help myself," she said, standing there with her straight frock and her pigtail like a forlorn child in a school scrape. "I said there was an aunt, and there's got to be an aunt. I was quite mad when I said it, of course, but I can't face your mother and tell her there isn't any aunt. I really can't." "Let me tell her," he said, coming nearer to her. "Let me tell her that, and tell her something else as well. Jane." "No, no, 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 no," said Jane, edging away round the table. "There's nothing to tell her. Don't tell her anything unless she asks. And don't come with her this evening, because if you do I shall laugh, or else I shall scream." "Well, don't worry," he said. "Everything will be all right. And Miss Antrobus, I can head her off if you don't want her." "Oh, no, you can't," said Jane. "I tried that. I said 5 guineas a week, and I thought your mother would say it was too much, but she never turned a hair. I mean, she didn't mind a bit. And Miss Antrobus is coming tomorrow to stay." "Oh, here she is back again. Whatever shall we do?" "But it wasn't Mrs. Rochester, it was Lucilla." "Thank goodness," said Jane. "Now go. I know you'll never respect me again now you know what a liar I am. But I can't help what you think of me. It's fate. I only wish you'd let me tell you what I think of you. You must know." But Jane had fled. And now, behold 2 agitated young women with money in their purses on their way to seek the help of Mr. Hugo. "I can't help it, I tell you," Jane kept saying. "I was driven into it. I said there was an aunt, and there must be an aunt. You know you can do it, Luce. If you could take me in, you could take anyone in. You must dress exactly as you did that day." "But I can't appear in a bonnet in my own house in the evening." "Caps, dear, there must be caps." "I wish you wouldn't. Couldn't the aunt be suddenly ill? Not able to see anyone? Then Mrs. Rochester would keep on coming till the aunt was better. And bring flowers, and grapes, and leave cards, and pump the servants. No, we've got to go through with it. What shall we say to Mr. Hugo? Tell him the truth. Say we're doing it for a lark." "So we are." "Yes," said Jane, and the 3rd-class railway carriage rang to the music of young laughter. "That's what it means in books when it says hollow mirth," said Jane. "Or the laughter of despair," suggested Lucilla. "But I call it a jolthead jest myself." "There aren't," said Jane, "any polite words for what I call it. And yet it's a sort of lark, too, after all, isn't it?" she ended appealingly. "Very sort of," said Lucilla. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "You may be sure that Miss Antrobus' sheets will be well aired, Mrs. Rochester. I may be old-fashioned, but I believe in airing everything. Sheets, pillowcases, cushion covers, towels, all are aired here, and aired thoroughly, you may rely upon it." Thus spoke very gently and seriously in a sweet, faded voice a delicious old lady in brown satin. Her grey hair was crowned with a cap of soft lace, and her chin, rather too rounded for age if one could have seen it properly, was buried in a lace fichu. Mr. Hugo had given the invaluable hint that convex shoulders suggest a concave chest, and the old lady stooped a great deal. Her hands, where the mittens let them show, were made up with consummate art and the tiniest grey wrinkles. Her forehead was very wrinkled, and these wrinkles were not painted, they were actual corrugations, fine and deep, even in the soft light of the drawing-room lamp, which Jane had hastily veiled with a blue chiffon scarf. The wrinkles showed plainly. The old lady sat in a big chair, her feet on a footstool, and on her satin lap knitting lay. Mrs. Rochester sat quite near her, trusting, talkative. You may wonder that she did not recall that her buffeting at the hands of Jane had been due to Jane's having mistaken her for her cousin dressed up, and hence made the short, irresistible deduction. But then you must remember that her own son had endorsed the fiction of Aunt Harriet's existence, and above all you must allow for the india-rubber forehead, complete with eyebrows and ear-coverings, supplied by the genius of Mr. Hugo. Mrs. Rochester was obviously wholly without suspicion, and Jane had to go out of the room expressly to laugh at the success of the play. Perhaps, too, she wanted to shift the whole burden of the interview on to Lucilla's shoulders for a little while. Her own felt stiff with the weight of the afternoon. At any rate, she got away and crept round and sat down behind the library door to listen unashamed. This is what rewarded her. "Now we have a moment alone, dear Miss Lucas," Mrs. Rochester was saying, in the high, clear voice of one who wishes to be understood by the rather deaf. "I should like to make a little confidence. These delightful nieces of yours, so light-hearted and free from care. Yes, but you will understand. I am sure Miss Antrobus will have a real home with you. And I have a rather special reason for having the dear girl's welfare very much at heart. I must confess to you that I look upon Miss Antrobus as a daughter already." "Indeed," said Aunt Harriet, almost too calmly. "One of your sons is engaged to the lady, then?" "My only son," said Mrs. Rochester. "It's an old attachment. They were little lovers as children, but it's not announced yet, so, of course, not a word to either of them. You, who know my dear boy so well, will feel with me that Hilda Antrobus is a lucky girl, and when you know her you will feel that he's lucky too. Yes?" "I cannot say that I know Mr. Rochester very well," said the spurious aunt. "He has called 2 or 3 times, I believe, but I daresay now Miss Antrobus is to be with us we shall see more of him." "Well played, Lucy," said Jane behind the library door. "I feel sure I may trust to your kind feeling to give the young people opportunities of being together, you understand? A little tact, a little blindness, a not too efficient chaperonage, a sort of je ne sais quoi. Not exactly the making of opportunities, but the smoothing away of obstacles, if obstacles are likely to occur. But I am sure you understand. Yes?" "I think so," said Aunt Harriet. "I am not myself an experienced matchmaker, but—" "Oh, but," said Mrs. Rochester, clasping her little grey, suede-covered hands, "the match is already made. I tell you this in confidence, though of course I have no objection to your telling your nieces, so long as they understand that it is a confidence. No congratulations, of course, no allusions even." Here the front door bell reverberated through the house. "But I am detaining you," said Mrs. Rochester. "You are expecting visitors?" "Not at all," said the wonderful aunt. "That is probably one of the maids. My housekeeper allows them to come in by the front door on their evenings out. She tells me it obviates those undesirable lingering partings in the shrubbery leading to the back premises." Here the drawing-room door opened and Stanley announced, "Mr. Tombs." Stanley was one of those admirable servants who seem made of wood and wire. She never glanced towards the ladies, but shut the door softly and retired as Mr. Tombs advanced. "Oh, poor Lucy," said Jane, and managed to get around to the drawing-room before Mr. Tombs had had time to do more than seek to excuse the lateness of his call. "Very late, I know, for a business call, but I thought it would save correspondence if I came personally to inquire." "If Mr. Tombs will wait in the library, my dear," said the aunt to Jane, "I shall be disengaged presently." "Oh, but I mustn't detain you." Mrs. Rochester spoke at once on this hint. "Our little talk is quite over. I have so enjoyed it, Miss Lucas. Good evening." "Oh no, I am not at all nervous. Besides, my son is waiting for me." Under cover of the lady's withdrawal, Mr. Tombs said, "I didn't know there was an aunt." "Well, there is, as you see," said Jane, resenting what she took to be a certain cavalierness of tone. "I beg your pardon," he said, turning his thin face and dark glasses towards her. "I have a detestable habit of thinking aloud. I was only wondering whether I ought to have addressed myself at first to the elder lady as a matter of courtesy, instead of to Miss Cray." "Oh, not at all," said Jane, mollified. "Auntie, this is Mr. Tombs, who is coming to stay with us tomorrow." Auntie greeted him with delicate, gentle cordiality. "I hope you will be happy with us, Mr. Tombs," she said. "We will do our best to make your visit a pleasant one. Or have you come to notify us of some alteration in your arrangements?" "Only in so far as to ask whether I may bring my traps in the afternoon instead of the morning, because I find—" "Certainly," said Jane, forgetting for a moment her part of subservient niece. "The rooms are ready." "Dear Jane," said her aunt gently, "Mr. Tombs was speaking. You were saying—" He said it again, and Jane remained tongue-tied while the untrue aunt answered with suave propriety. He replied suitably, and the interview ended by Jane's offering to show him out, an office which at all times appealed to her. "The maids are at supper," she said. In the hall he said, "I really am most awfully sorry I said I didn't know there was an aunt. I can't think how I could." "You won't see very much of her," said Jane. "Oh, the more the merrier, with such a delicious old lady. There I go again. Do please forgive me. I'm like Cheviot Hill. I'm a plain man. I speak as I think." Jane felt wonderfully cheered. "Oh, do you know Engaged?" she asked. "Isn't it lovely? Wouldn't it be jolly to act it?" "Very. May I ask whether you have enough guests to make up the cast?" "We shall be 6 altogether, as well as our gardener. And— but you'll see all of us tomorrow. Good night." Jane returned to Lucilla, who had torn off her wig, displaying her little red ears and crushed hair, and was huddling her elderly draperies together in preparation for flight. "Your Mr. Tombs is rather a lamb," said Jane, "and I do really think you're right about his having a nice face." "Oh, go away," said Lucilla. "You've got me into this, and now I shall never get out. Why, it's only for once." "Is it? Miss Antrobus will ask for Miss Lucas directly she gets here, and I shall have to go on acting and acting and acting, and I can't and won't do it. You'll have to tell them Miss Lucas is dead. I can't bear it, and I won't. Why didn't you be an aunt yourself if you wanted one?" "I can't act like you," said Jane, "and Mr. Tombs seeing me looking like a bald-faced stag. He didn't know it was you." "No, that's just it. You don't know what it feels like to be an old woman and have people look at you as if you weren't there." "Well, come and get the rags off," said Jane, "and we'll see if there's any way out of it. I suppose it would be a bit thick to have 2 aunts and have them appear on alternate evenings. Come on. Forbes will catch us if you don't look out. Suppose Aunt Harriet just receives Miss Antrobus tomorrow, and then she could have an illness, and drive 20 guineas a week away for fear of infection. I'd rather go through with it than that," said Lucilla, stumbling up the stairs in her long skirt. "It needn't be anything catching. She might have bronchitis or asthma. Something that lasts for months and doesn't kill you. Or fits." "I won't have fits," said Lucilla decidedly. "Whatever else I have, I won't have fits. And whatever we do, the servants will give us away." "Perhaps they won't. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Don't look at me in that wild way, Luce. Wash your face, for goodness sake, and comb your hair out. It looks as if you hadn't any. Make yourself look pretty again, whatever happens." "Oh, flattery's no good," said Lucilla bitterly. "I feel as if I were caught in a trap." "Look here," said Jane. "Shall we say our Aunt Harriet is subject to fits, not kicking and screaming ones, mild aberrations, and generally keeps in her room, and lock one of the rooms and chance the servants, and have people think I was a howling animal like the woman in Jane Eyre? Yes, her name was Rochester too. Not much. They wouldn't all think so. Mr. Rochester knows. Don't kill me. I had to tell him." But Lucilla seemed somehow calmer. Jane pursued her advantage. "I could tell Mr. Dix too, if you liked." "Bother Mr. Dix. He likes you very much. He's always asking where's Miss Cray. I'm interested in gardening, and he knows it. Don't try to hint things, Jane. You are only trying to make me angry on another side to distract my attention from that." She pointed to the wig. "But it won't do. There will Miss Quested be, all smiles and charms in her pretty frock. And Miss Cray? Oh, she's not at home this evening. And all the time she'll be here under those hot wigs and eyebrows, having no fun at all." This was indeed what happened. Think as they would, nothing better occurred to them than that Lucilla, as Aunt Harriet, should welcome her guests, and should be found placidly knitting when they came into the drawing-room after dinner. The guests all arrived during the afternoon, and were received by the elaborated aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, and the brother first. They came in taxicabs with a great deal of leathery new luggage, some trunks and some packing cases. The two men were pleasant and cheerful, with dark, smiling faces. Mrs. Thornton was also pleasant. They were all nice to Jane and very nice to Miss Lucas. "I do think they'll do," Lucilla said when they had been shown to their rooms. "They're new brooms, of course, but they seem jolly, and they talk as if they'd read books and seen people and done things. Whereas our last P.G.'s had perhaps seen things and certainly had done people. Us for one." "Never mind grammar," said Lucilla. "Are my eyebrows straight? They feel as crooked as a ram's horn." "They're as straight as I wish we were," said Jane. "The life of an adventuress is a terrible one. We are adventuresses, Lucilla, deceitful adventuresses. And here comes another cab or two. What a day, what a life." This time it was Miss Antrobus with worn luggage and not very much of it. She seemed to Jane to be a very grave, reserved sort of girl, hardly smiled when she shook hands. But when Lucilla smiled on her, the quiet smile of kindly age, and hoped in that soft voice that trembled a little as old voices do, that Miss Antrobus would be happy here, she smiled herself quite nicely and said, "I think it is very good of you to take me in. I hardly thought you would." But Lady Hesketh and Mrs. Rochester seemed quite sure. Jane did not quite like that, though she could not have told you why. "You are studying domestic economy?" the untrue aunt went on. "Not domestic, political," said Miss Antrobus gently. "But I have some other business to see to first. I shan't settle down to my economic studies very seriously just yet. I am working for the Help for Heroes Society." "You did hospital work through the war," Mrs. Rochester said, Jane put in. "I do think it must have been splendid." "We couldn't do anything. We were at school." "Yes, I was in France 3 years," said Miss Antrobus, and immediately turned from Jane to speak again to Miss Lucas. "I'm not going to like her," said Jane, when Miss Antrobus had followed her luggage into retirement. "I think I am," said Lucilla. "She was jolly decent to me." "Well, so were the others. And now there's only Mr. Tombs." "I shan't wait for him," said Lucilla. "He can come when he likes. He can see the precious aunt in the evening. That's enough for him. I'm going to be myself till dinner and go round the garden with the Thorntons and help you to introduce Mr. Dix and Mr. Rochester to them, and tell them Aunt Harriet is resting and will be in the drawing-room after dinner. It isn't 4 yet. I'm not going to stay like this for 4 or 5 hours, so don't you think it. The Thorntons were really very nice. Mrs. Thornton was young and very well dressed and very gay and friendly. The male Thorntons seemed to become instantly at home with Dix and Rochester, and the party had tea by the fountain, as much at ease as though they had known each other for years. The men had, of course, all been in the army, and that is a bond that makes itself felt at once. Miss Antrobus talked little, mostly to Mr. Dix, and when she spoke to Lucilla it was to ask whether they were not to have the pleasure of seeing Miss Lucas at tea. "No," said Lucilla unblushingly, "my aunt is not very strong. She rests a great deal. She cannot stand much society. I hope we shall see her at dinner. She dines in her own room, but she comes into the drawing-room after dinner." After this nothing seemed important to Jane except getting Mr. Dix away from Miss Antrobus. She did it by suggesting that they should all go and see the sundial, and then very hastily among the currant bushes she said to Dix, "You'll see my aunt tonight. Don't let anyone know you haven't seen her before." "I understand," he said. "Rochester told me." "Oh, did he?" said Jane. "All right, that's all I wanted to say. That's why I cut you off from Miss Antrobus. It would be kind of you to edge back to her now. You seem to be the only one of us that she's taken to." "She's rather wonderful, isn't she?" said Dix. "There's a sort of radiant goodness in her face." Jane, a little humbled, had not seen it, but could not gainsay it. "It's a strong face, and yet, I don't know, it looks to me as though she had been transplanted." "Transplanted?" "You know how different plants are in different environments. Look at those tall, splendid gypsy roses there. On the Sussex Downs in a dry season they're sometimes not an inch high. Lots of people got transplanted in the war." "Yes," said Jane, adding, for the second time that day, "Lucy and I didn't do anything. We were at school. No transplanting for us." "Some flowers don't need it," said Mr. Dix. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A very curious experience, this, of Lucilla's. To sit in an armchair with the weight of old age on her bowed shoulders, and on her brow the wrinkled india-rubber brand of 70 years. To be with these young people and not of them. To feel their glances meet hers, not with the hopeful give and take of youth and youth, but with the impersonal, distant, half-pitying tribute of youth to age. Curious, very. Not that the young people were neglectful of Miss Lucas, far from it. They were kind, they were attentive, they were deferent and courteous. They were everything that young people should be to old ladies. A really old lady would have found these manners charming, but to Lucilla these manners were intolerable. Her only comfort was the reflection that Dix and Rochester knew that under the wig and the wrinkles was hidden the real Lucilla, whose acting they must be secretly admiring. But the Thorntons did not know, and though they were kind, they were not interested. Yes, that was it. Lucilla was accustomed to being found interesting, and no amount of kindness or courtesy can make up in our fellow creatures for lack of interest. Mr. Tombs did not know, and he certainly had a nice face. Also, he was the one to ask whether they were not to have the pleasure of seeing Miss Cray. It was just after Mrs. Thornton had sung. She did not sing at all badly, but Lucilla sang really well, and instead of succeeding Mrs. Thornton at the piano and showing the company what singing really was, as she felt quite competent to do, She had to sit on in that wretched armchair holding that dull knitting and talking platitudes to people who did not care tuppence whether she talked or not, and only listened and spoke to her out of politeness. Miss Antrobus was the only exception. She really did seem to like the old lady and to take a pleasure in talking to her. Lucilla could have hugged her for it, but even her interest could not really charm. And when the clock struck 9, just after Mr. Tombs in that pleasant, languid, Oxfordish voice had asked about Miss Cray, Lucilla could bear it no longer. "She will be home quite soon now," she said, and rose. The abhorred knitting fell to the ground, and at least half the party stooped, or partly stooped, to restore it. Lucilla folded it resolutely and secured it with a bright knitting needle. "I have to keep early hours," she said gently, "but you mustn't let me break up the evening. And don't be afraid of disturbing me by music. I love music, and it will soothe me to sleep. Good night. Good night." She passed, stooping and slow, through the door, which 5 men sprang forward to open, and she felt that at least 3 sighs of relief were breathed when the door closed behind her. Like to like. Now they were all young together. Well, she was young too, really. Assured that Forbes and Stanley were safely in the kitchen, she sprang up the stairs 2 at a time, locked her door, tore off wig and eyebrows, and dressed with feverish speed. Excitement, annoyance, and the hasty and earnest removal of paint from her face gave her a colour she usually lacked. Her hair, dressed with extreme celerity, was suddenly kind, as your hair is now and then when you have not time to do it properly and bundle it up anyhow. It went exactly as it should have gone. The mignonette silk gown took on a new charm from the carnation of her cheeks, and when 20 minutes after the retirement of Miss Lucas, a rather breathless Lucilla entered the drawing-room, she was handsomer than she had ever been in her life. She knew this when she came face to face with herself in the Cupid and ribbon mirror, and at once became handsomer still. "Oh, here you are," said Jane. "I'm so glad. I was just saying that I can't sing much, but you sing like a bird." "Don't believe her," said Lucilla gaily. "She sings all right, but I've no breath left for singing. I had to hurry. To catch a train," she added, looking straight at Jane. And her look said, "That lie is chalked up to you, not to me. It is your fault, not mine, that I am forced to be so untruthful." But presently she was not too breathless to sing, and she sang folk songs because Mrs. Thornton had sung drawing-room ballads about rosebuds and stars. And now there was no lack of interest even before she sang. After her first song she was the centre of all things. Then she sang La Dove Prenda with Mr. Thornton, and it went very well. Then there were more duets and more solos, and then songs with choruses, old favourites of Jane's and Lucilla's, which the Thorntons also delightfully knew and liked. And altogether it was 11:30 before they knew where they were. Only Miss Antrobus, who had not much voice, asked, after Outward Bound it was, whether they were quite sure Miss Lucas would not be disturbed by such very robust vocalization. "Oh no, she loves it," said Lucilla shamelessly. "Auntie is wonderfully fond of old songs. I often sing them to her just to please her when we are alone. But I hope you're not bored." "Oh no," Miss Antrobus assured her. "I'm most interested, I assure you." This time Lucilla did not desire to hug Miss Antrobus. There was a hint of something. Patronage? Criticism? Suspicion? Antagonism? No, none of these exactly. Yet Lucilla was conscious of something inimical. But if she's really fond of John Rochester, that accounts. Lucilla told herself and turned to accede to a request from Mr. Tombs for My Lady Greensleeves. "Lucilla is like Sophie Traddles," said Jane. "She knows all the old songs that ever were invented." "My aunt, Miss Lucas, has a mine of them," said Lucilla, "and her taste is mine." And she began the charming old melody. It was a most successful evening, and when it was over Jane and Lucilla fell into each other's arms in a passion of mutual congratulations. "Aren't they dears? Even Miss Antrobus isn't so bad. And don't you think Mr. Tombs really has a nice face? Nice face, nice voice, nice manners, nice straight back, nice hands. But did you notice Mr. Thornton's hands? Those long, delicate fingers? He's an artist every inch. He's the one who plays the violin. The others are cello and double bass. How frightfully lucky we are. What times we shall have." "Yes," said Jane pensively. "And they're all fond of dancing." "Yes." Jane had become still more pensive, and was rolling and unrolling the ribbon of her girdle with a preoccupied little frown. "And they all like acting." "Yes." "Don't keep saying yes," said Lucilla, beginning to pull out hairpins. "What do you think of Miss Antrobus?" "I don't know. She is the one I don't feel sure about. She's the fly in the amber, or the toad in the ointment, or whatever it is. She didn't seem to fit in somehow. Mr. Rochester seemed to like her." "Yes," said Jane, "but not desperately, do you think?" "No, it's not a passionate affair. Friend of childhood's hour, and so on. So Mamma Rochester said." "What do you mean by affair?" "Didn't I tell you?" Lucilla asked, brushing vigorously. "Mamma Rochester hinted all sorts of things." Lucilla stopped. Through the double curtain of her hair she had seen in the mirror Jane's face. Ought she to have gone on? To have told Jane all that Mrs. Rochester had said? Anyhow, she didn't. And anyhow, it did not matter, because Jane had heard every word through the library door. Why did not Jane tell Lucilla that she had listened to Mrs. Rochester's poisonous confidences? It was not that she was ashamed of listening. When she began to listen she pictured herself telling Lucilla afterwards and laughing over it with her. But she had not told her, and she did not tell her now. Instead she said, "What sort of things?" "Oh, the usual stuff that sort of woman would hint. That we needn't hope that my Lord Rochester would throw the handkerchief to either of us because his mamma had other views for him." "What did she say exactly?" "Oh, nothing exactly. But I gathered that mamma would be quite pleased if Mr. Rochester didn't admire Jane or Lucy." "So Miss Antrobus is sent here to spy? I thought there was something of that sort. That must be what makes one feel uncomfortable with her." "Oh, but I don't think that," said Lucilla, forgetting that she had felt something very like it, and only remembering that Miss Antrobus had been nice to the unreal aunt. "I think she's a kind girl, really, and straight." "She's come to spy out the land," said Jane with conviction. "Well, she's welcome to all she can find out. Good night, Luce." But she reopened the door expressly to put her head round it and whisper, "I say, Luce, 8 people. Enough for the Lancers. And 4 of them pigs. Beautiful, fat, profitable pigs. 17 guineas a week pigs, Luce, my dear. Good night." There is no doubt that fortune smiles on the brave. At any rate, it smiled broadly from the first on Jane and Lucilla. Even their misfortunes were mitigated. Their trustee defaulted, but he left them a house and garden and a nest egg. The house and garden was too small to make money out of, but at once almost Cedar Court loomed on a not distant horizon. Jane tumbled downstairs, but she, so to speak, tumbled into possession of the garden room. They could not afford an expert gardener and bailiff, and destiny took them to Madame Tussaud's, and behold, embodied in Mr. Dix, the perfect bailiff and gardener. Old Mr. Rochester threatened to become an embarrassment, and at once he retired to Tibet. They had no servant really attached to their interests, but before they had time to feel this deeply, behold Gladys. They desired competent servants, and Forbes and Stanley were added to their staff. Mrs. Adela Dadd happened. But then so directly afterwards did Mrs. Doveton. The 3 greedy sisters went away without paying, but they were succeeded by the Thorntons and by Mr. Tombs, who did pay. This sort of luck does, beyond doubt, attend on some people, and it transcends all other blessings. That is why we say, it is better to be lucky than rich. Caesar had this sort of luck. Napoleon had it. Jane and Lucy had it. But this sort of luck is a bridge that sooner or later gives way. Napoleon met Blücher at Waterloo. Caesar, even at the base of Pompey's statue, met a greater than Blücher. And Jane and Lucy felt almost from the first that in Miss Antrobus they had met a personality that, as gypsies would say, crossed their luck. A vague but undeniable sense of uneasiness persisted in and through and under and over the pleasant days that now followed each other at Cedar Court. It was not a strong feeling, not an overpowering discomfort. It did not destroy pleasure, but it leavened it. Quietly, persistently, unceasingly, it bored its way into everything. It was like a slight toothache, which the will may decide to ignore, but which goes on all the same in that hinterland of the subconscious, where the will has no sovereignty. The thing could not be put into words. It was as elusive as a bird's song or a flower scent. All you could say about it was that it was here and that it was antagonistic. It was not that Miss Antrobus withdrew herself from the gaieties of Cedar Court. On the contrary, she participated in every single one. She did not sing, but she could play accompaniments. She was a poor actress, but a good prompter and an excellent audience. Her time was always at anyone's disposal, and she had all the time there was. She had too much time. She was always there. She never went to London. She never walked out except in the garden. She was always amiable and obliging, but she was always there. And she seemed to be always looking on. And she looks on through a spyglass, said Jane. A tortoise-shell lorgnette, or whatever it is, like Mrs. Rochester had. Or perhaps she looks at us through a microscope as if we were beetles, or those things with legs that come out of pond water. She doesn't look at Miss Lucas like that, said Lucilla. No, said Jane, that's the worst of it. She's a great deal too nice to Miss Lucas. It's not natural. She asks after her every morning. She offers to go and sit with her, to read to her, take her out for drives. That's easy for you. You've only got to say I'm not strong enough. But when she comes and sits beside me in the evenings and offers to hold my wool and tells me she's sure I should enjoy a drive, and is so nice and kind, well, if it's genuine, she's a dear. But if it's only that she suspects that I'm not really an aunt, then, well... Yes, that's it, said Jane. That dreadful aunt is our weak point. She's the dead secret, the skeleton in the cupboard. If it wasn't for her we could defy 50 Miss Antrobuses. But as it is, Lucilla pointed out, we can't. What a name, too. Antrobus. It makes me think of a medieval engine of war. Halberds and battering rams and antrobuses. I'm sure I've read that somewhere. I always thought all antrobuses had big hooky noses. You know, noses that snort at you and say, ha-ha, like the war horse. But really, I believe she's all right. It's only our guilty consciences. And Mr. Rochester says she's much jollier than she used to be. And as she was the friend of his childhood, he must have thought her pretty nice then. So that by now... I didn't take it that way. What he said was that the war had been the making of her, and he'd never thought she had so much stuff in her. That doesn't sound very... No, does it? I don't think the noble lord will throw a handkerchief to a girl he never thought had so much in her, do you? He's very nice to her, said Jane. Yes, said the diplomatic Lucilla. Too nice for it to mean anything. Yes, said Jane. It's as if he was saying all the time, I'll be a brother to you, I really will. If there was anything, there'd be more ups and downs." "I don't know how you know," said Lucilla. "Perhaps I don't. But you must remember I was adored once too, like Sir Andrew Aguecheek." "Oh, when?" cried Lucilla eagerly. "In a former state of existence," said Jane. "All girls must have been. That's how they know so much about love affairs before they ever have one. Look here, let's do something new and different. Let's have a prize competition." "Like anagram teas?" "Yes, but not anagrams. We'll have a prize for the best solution of the problem of how to get rid of Othello. He's always getting out of the hutch and eating Mr. Dix's choicest fruits and flowers. And a prize for the best poem about Cedar Court. And for the best way of getting the silver out from behind that fireplace without taking the whole thing out, because the mantelpiece is built all round it. And another prize—" A discreet tap at the door stopped her. "Please, miss," said Mrs. Doveton, "might I have a word with you?" "No, don't go, Miss Jane. I want to have—" "Not words with us," said Jane. "No, miss, far from it. But I do want to speak plainly." "Oh dear," said Jane. "Whatever has gone wrong now?" "It's that Gladys," said Mrs. Doveton. "So now you know." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "That girl," said Mrs. Doveton. "She's an epidemic," said Jane and Lucilla. "An epidemic, miss. She's catching like measles and whooping cough. She catches every man she comes near, and the more the merrier, so she thinks." Mrs. Doveton breathed heavily. "Sit down and tell us all about it," Lucilla said comfortably, and a green velvet armchair creaked to Mrs. Doveton's acceptance of the invitation. "There aren't no bounds to her," Mrs. Doveton went on. "There's Mr. Simmons, he's hooked all right, and there's the butcher's young man, she was out with him Tuesday week, and the very boy that brings the daily papers, she stopped him in the shrubbery to ask him riddles." "Well, there's no harm in that," said Jane. "Some people think riddles amusing. I don't myself, but some people do. Some riddles is all right, like why is Westminster Abbey like the fender, and why is a hen crossing the road like Guy Fawkes? But when it comes to asking him what animal falls down from the clouds, well—" "What animal does? I didn't know any animal did," said Lucilla. "That's what the young boy said, miss, and then that Gladys, she says, 'Don't know what animal falls from the clouds? Why, the reindeer.' See, miss, the reindeer, just an excuse for calling the very paper boy dear. And chucks him under the chin, she does, and asks him whether he ain't looking for a sweetheart." "It's very silly of Gladys," said Lucilla, trying not to smile. "I'll speak to her." But Jane laughed and said, "It's very funny, don't you think? But dear Mrs. Doveton, why should it upset you?" "It's not respectable, miss, that's why. I never see such a gal. Ask the postman what his young lady's name is, just to find out if he's got one. Because if not, here's Gladys all ready and willing." "I suppose the postman can take care of himself," said Lucilla. "Let's hope so, I'm sure," said Mrs. Doveton gloomily, beating the palm of her hand on the arm of her chair. "But there's them as can't. The girl's like a raging lion going to and fro seeking who she may walk out with." "I thought it was Simmons," said Jane. "So it was, and is, and ought to be," said Mrs. Doveton earnestly. "He's a sober, solid man that won't hurt to have his head turned for a week or two. But once married, he'll be master. But meanwhile, here's the gal going this way and that, and bursting out here, there, and everywhere like a November cracker. And there's no knowing who'll be hurt before she's pinned down for good and the sauce knocked out of her." "I don't suppose the postman—" Lucilla began, but Mrs. Doveton went on unregarding. "Young gels like her ought to be put in homes or labelled dangerous. She doesn't stick at anything. She's been writing to my Herb. Yes, Miss Jane, well may you look. I thought it was his receipt from the Polytechnic, and I opened it little thinking. And it was to thank him ever so for the lovely chalks, and Friday evening, same time and place, and so long, old dear, and 17 crosses in blue ink. Mrs. Doveton sobbed and dabbed her eyes with a blue checkered duster. And I've got no hold over the girl. Herbert I can control, or could, but not Gladys. Nobody can. Show her a young man and she's off like a spider after a fly, or more like a dog after a rabbit, for there's no sitting quiet and watching about her. But if she's fond of Herbert and he's fond of her— "Bless you," said Mrs. Doveton, "she ain't fond of anybody. It amuses her to see 'em jigging on the end of a string, but my Herbert's a serious young man, and he looks to better himself and rise in life. And then she butts in and spoils everything for him and does herself no good. It's for all the world like a mouse falling into a pan of cream, no benefit to any of the parties concerned." "All right," said Jane, "you speak to Herbert and I'll speak to Gladys." "I've spoke to Herb," said Herbert's mother, "and he says not to interfere, and I don't know what roseate hues of early dawn a true woman can cast over a young man's life." "Lor," said Mrs. Doveton in a burst of exasperation, "I wish all young gals could be married and put out of the way the minute they leave school. A gal ought to be married young, it's best for her, keeps her out of mischief, and she soon gets 2 or 3 little weights hanging on to her apron strings to keep her steady. Young gels is best married." "And young men?" Jane asked. "Let 'em keep single as long as they can," said Mrs. Doveton, "for a young man married is a young man marred." "It would be a queer world if Mrs. Doveton had the arranging of it," said Lucilla as the door closed behind the anxious mother. "Come on, let's go and tell Gladys not to." Gladys was in the shop. She was in the shop almost all the time now. Jane and Lucilla felt their hands to be full with the much more pleasant duty of entertaining their agreeable and punctually paying guests. "Look here, Gladys," said Jane, sitting down between a sieve of apples and a pile of giant marrows, for it was now August and the shop looked like a harvest Thanksgiving. "What have you been doing to Herbert Doveton?" "I ain't done nothing to him." "Haven't you kissed him?" Jane asked severely. "Oh, that," said Gladys. "Oh, yes, I kissed him," and she giggled reminiscently. "I thought it would do him good. He was so set up. He's better now, gives you a kiss quite natural. You've no idea really what he was like to begin with. You'll hardly believe it, miss, I know, but I'm his first. I am really." "And are you fond of him?" "Me, miss? Fond of him? Why, he's more like a dried haddock than a young man. I only tried to show him a bit of life and put him in the way of enjoying himself. For what's life to a young man without a girl to go out with? Why, nothing." "Now look here, Gladys," said Jane, very firmly and seriously. "This has got to stop, see? You mustn't show that young man any more life, as you call it. You don't want him, and it worries Mrs. Doveton." "Mothers can't have it all their own way," said Gladys mutinously. "Do you keep a list of your sweethearts?" Lucilla asked suddenly. Gladys actually blushed. "Not to say sweethearts, I don't like the word anyhow," she said, "but I do make a note of the names of them as I've walked out with, only initials, you know, in the end of me hymn book. Nobody would know to look at it. Why, I forget myself what the letters stand for sometimes, I do assure you, miss." "Well," said Lucilla, "you put down H.D. and then you give him up, will you? To please me?" "Oh, to please you, miss," said Gladys gracefully. "I'd do more than give up a little thing like that. If you'll lend me a stamp and an envelope, I'll drop him a line this very minute to tell him cruel fate has come betwixt, and it can never, never be." "And what about Mr. Simmons?" A curious change came over the face of Gladys. She looked like a child who in the midst of make-believe is reminded of some real and treasured possession. "Oh, him," she said slowly. "Well, if you care anything about him, you'd better be careful. Suppose he found out about the others." "Oh, you don't understand, miss. I tell him about all the others, every one of them." and what they say and all. And doesn't he mind?" A look of elfish cunning puckered the face of Gladys. "He don't believe me, miss. He thinks I make it all up to amuse him like. So that's all right. Only if he did find anything out, he couldn't never say I hadn't told him, see? So I'm all right whatever happens." "Well, spare Herbert anyhow," said Jane, and she and Lucilla escaped to the garden, the final words of Gladys pursuing them. "I'll spare him by the very next post, miss, you may depend." Looking back afterwards, it always seemed to Lucilla and Jane that that autumn was the merriest time of their lives. Money was coming in plentifully, both from the house and from the garden, whose resources Mr. Dix was exploiting in a way that seemed to them simply masterly. The balance at the bank was rising like a tide, and the relations between the right and the left hand of the bank book grew more and more such as we all wish to see. Life was simple and satisfying. Nor was it by pleasure only that it was so entirely filled. There was work. The shop a little, accounts a little, and a good deal of cutting out and making of clothes, their own and not their own. Miss Antrobus had interests outside Cedar Court. She never spoke of them to Jane or Lucilla, but she poured them into the ear of Miss Lucas in that after-dinner hour which was Lucilla's torture and Jane's remorse. She told of children whose fathers had fallen in France and who now, in the land that was to be a land fit for heroes, lacked food and clothes and everything that makes life comfortable. Did Miss Lucas think her nieces would help? The stuff could be found. It wouldn't cost them anything but time. Miss Lucas was sure they would, and they did. But how terrible that they should need charity, said Miss Lucas, clicking the eternal knitting needles. Yes, said Miss Antrobus, but it's no use our arguing about that. What we've got to do is to see that a few of the little Toms and Sallys are just the least bit more comfortable than they would be without us. That's all we can do just now. And this they did. Miss Lucas only lasted 3 weeks. Lucilla could not endure her any longer. Miss Antrobus' kind attentions and her amiable enquiries became more and more intolerable, and at last Lucilla flatly refused to go on with the business. If Miss Antrobus can't do without a chaperone, she said, she must go and look for one somewhere else. Surely Mrs. Thornton is chaperone enough for anything. Besides, what does a girl want with chaperones when she's been a WAC or a VAD? Or whatever it was that Miss Antrobus was. I could stand it if she wasn't so hatefully civil to the old lady. Mr. Tombs is civil too. So's everybody if it comes to that, but Mr. Tombs is civil like Sir Walter Raleigh laying down his cloak for an aged queen to walk on. Miss Antrobus, well, I think there's such a thing as being too civil by half. Where is she now? Gardening. Mr. Dix says she's a very promising gardener. It seems to me that she's a very competent person. She can cook. She told me so. I mean, she told Aunt Harriet so. And she understands sick nursing and making clothes and now gardening. She says the more things you can do, the more interesting life is. I've often said that myself, said Jane, yawning. Ah, said Lucilla, but she does them, and you've got to do what I say. Let Aunt Harriet vanish decently, or I shall give the whole show away. I know I shall. The prize problem party never took place after all, for the problems were solved as soon as propounded. Gladys was influenced to take back her gift on the ground that Othello, who Mr. Dix said ought to have been called Desdemona, must be lonely. Why not give him or her to Mr. Simmons, who already had other rabbits? Jane and Lucilla explained how much they had enjoyed owning Othello, and how they could not bear to stand in his or her light if a more agreeable social life seemed to open before him or her. So Othello went away, and Mr. Dix and his under-gardeners rejoiced. The problem of the buried silver provided a pleasant dinner topic. The story of the burglar was told by Lucilla. Aunt Harriet kept her room that evening, and though the story assumed a good deal that hadn't been so, it made quite a good story with Mr. Dix introduced as an anonymous stranger sheltering in the summer house from the rain. "And that's months ago," said Mr. Thornton. "And you've left your poor silver there ever since?" "Why, Dix could have got it out for you in no time." "He didn't know. Nobody knew. We've only just made up our minds to tell, because really we must get the silver up again." "How much is there?" asked the other Mr. Thornton, the one called Bill. "Oh, just the teapot and milk jug and sugar basin. We put the spoons in our pockets." "We'll get it out for you. Not tonight because we're playing at that concert, but tomorrow." And sure enough they did, with fishhooks and weights coated with birdlime or something sticky. They fished behind the stove and up came the silver, rather yellow but not much dented, and not a chip of the panelled mantelpiece disturbed. "Not at all," they said, to the thanks of Lucilla and Jane. "It's a pleasure. I wish you'd let us do more things for you. Shall we clean the silver? We're rather a dab at that." And they did it, too, amid laughter and jokes in the summer house for fear of Forbes catching them at it. Certainly the Thorntons were very kind as well as very jolly. They really were ideal paying guests. They were energetic photographers and photographed the girls and the house, reluctant Mrs. Doveton and enthusiastic Gladys. They played at concerts with sufficient frequency to give their presence at home an added value. In all weather they sallied out, their evening dress closely hidden under mackintoshes, their great instruments duly encased, returning often long after everyone had gone to bed. And they were always punctual in the breakfast-room, the two men cheery and attentive, and Mrs. Thornton as pretty and as fresh as a pink. They never played their instruments at Cedar Court, though they sang and acted readily enough. "We like a holiday from them when we can get it," Mrs. Thornton explained. "They're our shop. You should never mix the shop and the home." "I hope your aunt is not seriously ill, you know," said Mr. Thornton that evening when for the second time Miss Lucas failed to appear in the drawing-room. "Oh, no," said Lucilla, and then suddenly, after a queer little pause, "She's much better. In fact, she's gone to Bath today with my cousin." "I should have liked to say good-bye to her," said Mr. Tombs. "We shall miss her, shan't we?" It may have been her guilty conscience that made Lucilla feel almost sure that there had been a twinkle in Mr. Tombs' eye. But Miss Antrobus said outright, "When did she go?" "This morning, while you were at your Help for Heroes committee meeting," Lucilla told her, triumphing in the fact that there had been a space of time in which a dozen Aunt Harriets could have got away without Miss Antrobus' notice. "I am so sorry I missed seeing her," said Miss Antrobus calmly. "I must write and tell her so. What is her address?" End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lucilla had not thought of that. "I will give you the address this evening," she said. And in the evening it was, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll give you the address in the morning." "If it wouldn't be too much trouble I should be so glad if I could have it now," said Miss Antrobus. "I usually write my letters at night." "Certainly," said Lucilla, and went straight to the mahogany bureau and began to fumble in the pigeonholes. Miss Antrobus followed her. "It's very kind of you to look for it now," she said, "but surely it is not among those paper patterns." "I don't know where it is," said Lucilla, shutting the secretaire lid with what was almost a bang. "Perhaps it's upstairs. I'll go and look." And she fled. She returned very soon with an envelope on which she had written, "Miss Lucas at Mrs. Scott's, 247 Hill Street, Bath." "Thank you so much," said Miss Antrobus. "Hill Street? Whereabouts is it?" "I don't know, I'm sure," said the badgered Lucilla. "I've never been to Bath." But she felt quite safe because she had taken the precaution to consult Miss Austen's persuasion before deciding on an address for her aunt at Bath. "May I have the address too?" asked Mr. Tombs. "I should like to follow Miss Antrobus' excellent example and write to our dear Miss Lucas. But Mr. Thornton is just going to play the Lancers. Miss Antrobus, may I have the pleasure? Thank you. And Miss Cray, may I ask you for the next dance? If there is a next one, I shall be very pleased. Oh, there is to be a next one, he assured her. Miss Quested has decided that it is to be a dancing evening. On with the dance. Let joy be unrefined, said Lucilla. Thank you, said Mr. Tombs. That's one of my favourite quotations. Let us be tops, Miss Antrobus. But I must lend a hand with the furniture. I shouldn't have thought Mr. Tombs would have cared for dancing, said Miss Antrobus. But he waltzes extraordinarily well, doesn't he? So unexpected. Do you think that blue glasses don't go well with dancing, then? Appearances are deceitful sometimes. I know they are, said Miss Antrobus. And there is something about blue glasses that looks a little, well, furtive, don't you think? I hadn't thought it, said Lucilla, laughing. It's rather hard, isn't it, if people can't wear blue glasses without being suspected of, what would the noun be, furtivity? I didn't really mean that I thought our friend deceitful, said Miss Antrobus. I shouldn't like to think it. I loathe deceit. Yes, it is horrid, isn't it? And as Mr. Thornton, the one called Bill, now came to claim her for the dance, she went on, I'm sure you hate deceit too, don't you, Mr. Thornton? The soul should be an open book in which all passers-by may look, and naught that any would not care to read should e'er be written there, replied the young man promptly. Whose is that? Asked Miss Antrobus. I seem to know it. It's by Anon, I think, that popular author, said he, but as he led Lucilla away he whispered, I made it up, of course. Didn't she see I was making it up? One never knows what she does or doesn't see, Lucilla permitted herself to say. No, but anyhow, what a lot there is that she doesn't see, that nobody sees. What a little window it is, anyhow, that you look in at anyone else by, isn't it? Yes, in this sea of life enisled, quoted Lucilla. Exactly, said he, and there's no Lancers like the old original. Jim always plays them. Tum-titty-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. What a glorious game dancing is. Score each point as you come to it, even if it's the last, he said, as he led flushed and panting Lucilla to cool on the front door steps. That's my philosophy of life. Even if the world ends tomorrow, well, we've had tonight. If it ends tonight, well, I've had this dance with you. And I may have the next, and the next, and the next, and the one after that. Mr. Tombs, murmured Lucilla, much agitated by this sudden advance. I'm dancing the next one with Mr. Tombs. He brought her a chair from the hall. And you? She said. I can sit at your feet, said he, my proper place. And he sat down on the doorstep. Now give me a flower, one of those apricot-scented roses. And be kind to me. Who knows but the world may end tonight? Do you always talk nonsense when you've been dancing? Said Lucilla, defending herself as best she could against this sudden swirl of an unknown sea of flattery. Not always, but tonight's such a night, and you're all such darlings, and it's such a long time since I've danced or talked with people who are real people, that my head's in a whirl and I see everything double. I dare say I really see you twice as charming as you are, but my fixed illusion is that you are far more than twice as charming than you appear. Lucilla did not know what to say, so she said nothing. You don't mind my talking nonsense, he said. Let's pretend you're an Italian lady and this isn't the gravel path but a canal in Venice. And that isn't the garden roller, but the end of my gondola. And I'm here at the peril of my life just to tread one measure with you and tell you once more that you are the radiant star of my dreams. And though you're a noble Venetian lady and I'm only a poor outlaw with a price on my head, yet you stoop from the throne of your maiden magnificence and lend me in one instance of cold condescension your hand that is like a lily. He glanced behind her. The hall was deserted. The others had gone out through the French windows on to the cedar lawn. He took her hand and kissed it, very lightly and softly, then laid it down on her lap as gently as though it had indeed been a flower. "Don't say we'd better find the others. Forgive me instead. It's only a sort of play acting, to fit the night. And in that rose-coloured dress you do look the part. You do forgive me? Yes, I see you think I'm either very mad or very insolent, but really I'm not. Don't keep it in your mind against me, will you? Look upon it as a sort of charade, a charade that doesn't count or matter a bit. And don't look at me like that. For God's sake, don't be afraid of me. I'm sorry I played the fool. Say it's all right." "I suppose so," said Lucilla feebly, "but I don't think I like that sort of charade. I don't know my part, you see," she added, trying to speak as though it had been really a play. He turned his head away, and she thought she heard him say, "I wish to God I could teach you." But the next moment he laughed and said, "Let my faults be writ in water. How I wish we could have more dancing evenings. I'm sick of dragging that double bass about. Anyway, I'm going to enjoy this. No Venetian ladies for me. No gondolas. Just Miss Cray and the next waltz but two, may I?" Lucilla did not know how to say no. And besides, she was not sure that no was what she wanted to say. The acting of the Mr. Thornton who was called Bill had been wonderfully lifelike, and that touch of warm, live velvet on her hand, she had known nothing like it. She felt as though those 5 minutes had upset all her ideas on all important subjects. She wanted to be alone, to think, to remember every word he had said, to make up her mind whether she ought to have been angry, to have walked away as soon as he began with, "Now give me a flower." No, it began before that. How was it began? He, meanwhile, was talking of Schubert's songs. The strains of a waltz sounded. "I ought to play that," he said. "It's my brother's turn to dance." And Lucilla, entering the drawing-room on his arm, met herself in the mirror of the Cupids, and almost felt as though the kiss on her hand were branded on her cheek. "How different I look," she thought. And then, as if one adventure in one evening were not enough, Mr. Tombs murmured as they waltzed, "Let us go round the garden the minute the music stops. The paths are quite dry. I have something really important to say to you." "All right," said Lucilla. She could not say no. To do so would be to admit to herself that she feared that Mr. Tombs also might desire to act Venetian charades and imprint velvet salutes upon hands like lilies. Also, at the very bottom of her mind, something lurked that was not unlike a sort of curiosity to know how, if at all, Mr. Tombs would act his charade. La petite vient en mangeant, so they say. And if Mr. Tombs did act Venetian charades, she would not be taken by surprise this time. Gently but firmly, with true dignity and self-possession, she would put Mr. Tombs in his place, would show him that she was not to be flattered and fooled like a silly, inexperienced girl, because she was, of course, something quite different. So as the dance ended, she allowed herself to be led through the French window and round by the shrubbery and by winding walks to the sundial. "Do sit down," said Mr. Tombs. "There are cushions. I brought them out after the last dance." "What did you do with Miss Antrobus?" "Oh, I brought her out too." "That's right. I'll sit here." He lowered himself to the brick step at her feet. Lucilla felt a little shiver of anxiety. Surely he wouldn't begin exactly as Mr. Thornton had. She remembered now how he had begun. Did all men say precisely the same things at dances? Perhaps it was a formula like, "May I have the pleasure?" Was he going to say... He was. "I'll sit at your feet. It's my proper place," he said, and instantly opened a new gambit. "Because I want to be as humble as possible. And I want you not to resent what I'm going to say and snub me. Promise? But how do I know that I oughtn't to snub you? Lucilla asked. "Don't tempt me to say things that you might want to snub me for. Though I should never— I mean, in affairs of my own I am not accustomed to being snubbed. I never advance except on sure ground." "Oh, what is he going to say?" Lucilla asked herself. "Does he mean that I've encouraged him? Oh, I wish I hadn't come. What an awfully nice voice he has." "You said you wanted to say something important," she found herself saying aloud. "Why not say it? Come, that's not so bad. Very neat and frosty." "I will," said he. "I don't know why I hesitate. I won't. Here goes. It's about Miss Antrobus." "Oh," said Lucilla flatly, and began to fan herself, though the night air was cool and fresh all about her. "And what about Miss Antrobus?" "I'm afraid she's going to be a nuisance. She's made up her mind that you have not been at all kind to your aunt, and that the poor old lady has been sent away to some sort of home or institution." "Good gracious," said Lucilla feebly. "She says that Miss Lucas has never been allowed to be alone with any of us, that you have never been at home when Miss Lucas was with us, that Miss Quested has always been disgracefully neglectful of your aunt, has never once spoken to her except to say good night, that neither of you have ever shown the faintest interest in the old lady's ailments, that the old lady has never been outside the house since the day we all came, until you sent her away. Then when Miss Antrobus has offered to read to her or take her out, you and Miss Quested have always thrown cold water on her proposals. She says she's determined to sift the matter to the bottom. If there's a society for the prevention of cruelty to aunts, she'll set it on to you." "Oh dear," said Lucilla. "Oh my goodness, how perfectly awful." "I thought you'd like me to tell you about it," Mr. Tombs went on, "and at once, because I don't know what she'll do or say next." "Oh, rather," said Lucilla eagerly, quite forgetting what it was that she had more than half expected him to tell her. "I think it's most awfully decent of you. But what can I do? I feel all to pieces. What can I do?" "Well, if I were you," said Mr. Tombs slowly, "I should tell her all about your aunt." "All about my aunt?" "Yes, tell her the truth, you know." "But—" said Lucilla. "Yes, I know," said Mr. Tombs. "She'll be awfully annoyed at having been taken in, I daresay. But anything's better than her going to societies about your affairs." "Taken in?" repeated Lucilla automatically, and not with any hope of continued concealment. "Well, you know," said Mr. Tombs gently, "you did it most awfully well, and I didn't tumble to it myself till the third evening. Your acting's been magnificent. I should tell her the first thing tomorrow. Treat it as a joke. Tell her it's gone far enough. Of course, I'll pretend to have been taken in all the time, too. That'll make it easier for her. And the others, must I tell them too?" "No necessity at all," said Mr. Tombs. "Oh, they're beginning to play again. We must go in," said Lucilla, jumping up. "Mr. Tombs, you really are a lamb to have warned me. I'll tell her tomorrow." This, you would have thought, was enough to complete the evening's happenings. But no. After a most enjoyable foxtrot, the elder Mr. Thornton asked leave to tell Lucilla that Miss Antrobus had the knife into her, and advised her to own that she, Lucilla, and she only, had been in truth Aunt Harriet. "You acted splendidly," he said. "No one could have spotted you. Only we're professionals, you see, and even we didn't catch on for the first day or two. It was Miss Quested's cold, cynical indifference to her aunt that opened my wife's eyes and gave the show away. Do you think anyone else guesses?" "Oh no," said Mr. Thornton eagerly. "Rochester and Dix and Tombs are absolutely deceived. You ought to go on the stage. Such acting. By an amateur. So delicate, so sustained. It was absolutely a triumph. If only Miss Quested had acted the good niece 100th part as well as you acted the good aunt. But she didn't. If you'll allow me to advise you, You'll let the cat out of the bag to Miss Antrobus at the earliest possible moment." Mr. Rochester found an opportunity to say, "Hilda Antrobus is on the warpath. I should own up if I were you." And Mr. Dix crowned the evening by saying, "You'll have to tell Miss Antrobus. She thinks your aunt has been unkindly used, and she's so generous and fine. She hates unkindness. You'll have to undeceive her. She won't be hard on you. She's the soul of goodness and gentleness, and so strong and faithful with it. She loathes deception of any kind, that's all. Have it out and get it over. Clear the sky. She'll forgive you." "Oh, will she?" said Lucilla. And that night she entered Jane's room expressly to say, "Serpent, this is your work," and to tell Jane all the events of the evening. Well, perhaps not quite all. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Now you clear out," said Jane next morning. "Go right off into the garden while I tackle the Antrobus and the halberdiers and the engines of war. It was all my doing, and I'll take what's left of the bother. You've had more than your share, you poor old martyr. I'll do it directly after breakfast." But it appeared that Miss Antrobus had gone out before breakfast and had not returned. Lucilla wondered miserably whether the anxious reformer had gone to interview the Society for the Protection of Aged Relatives. After breakfast she withdrew to the garden with basket and scissors, and it was here that Mr. Thornton, the one called Bill, came upon her among the early chrysanthemums. "I say," he began, "about last night. I want you to forget it." Charles Reade supplied Lucilla with a sufficiently apt quotation. "Never remind a lady of what you wish her to forget," she said. "Now that's most awfully good of you," he said, "but I do want to say that I really am not the bounding ass you must be thinking me. The fact is, my profession doesn't bring me the acquaintance of people like you and your cousin. And the war was so damnable. I beg your pardon. And the afterwards. Do you know, we three nearly starved before we got hold of a paying profession. I mean paying engagements. Oh, we're all right now, but that sort of thing half turns your head. We've slept on the embankment. We three. Yes, really. And now we're all right again, it's true. But anyhow, say you forgive me?" "Oh, it was only nonsense," said Lucilla, bold in the autumn sunshine. "Don't let's fuss. You might carry these into the shop for me, will you?" She pressed a bundle of stiff, twiggy, dewy wet chrysanthemums on him and went on down the row, snipping busily here and there among the foam of flowers, creamy and pink and golden. She cut far more than were needed and carried them to the shop. Here she resolved to stay till Jane should have dealt with Miss Antrobus, though she had a sinking feeling that it would rather be Miss Antrobus who would deal with Jane. Gladys was there, of course, and all Gladys's talk was of Mr. Thornton, the one called Bill. Unerring instinct, a sort of impish clairvoyance, guided Gladys in all matters pertaining to walking out and the sentiments which lead to such perambulations. Lucilla felt hotly that Gladys knew, as well as if she had been present, that there had been something last night, something not quite in the usual order of things, between her and that Mr. Thornton, the one as ain't married. "When he come in just now," said Gladys, "with them flowers, I knew that instant minute as he'd got something on his mind. Do you think his young lady's been being aughty to him, miss?" "I'm sure I don't know," said Lucilla. "I should think twice afore I cast him over for ever, if I were her. He's a gentleman, he is. His hairbrushes has silver backs. Oh no, that's Mrs. Thornton, to be sure, but it's all in the family. And he gives me 5 bob when I sewed on the bows on his evening shoes." Lucilla defended herself with the heaviest of the account books. "Don't talk," she said. "I'm busy. In fact, you might as well go and see if you can help Mrs. Doveton. I'll take the shop for an hour or two." If I was his young lady, I should throw him a kind word. It don't do to let 'em get too downhearted," said Gladys. "If they gets too miserable, they makes away with themselves, sometimes." "Have any of your sweethearts committed suicide, Gladys?" Lucilla could not help asking. "I wish you wouldn't use that low word, miss. No, none of the gentlemen I've walked out with ain't gone so far as that. When I said make away with themselves, I meant making away to some other young lady not worth his notice, most likely. All right, miss, I'm going." She went, and almost at once Miss Antrobus darkened the door. "Good morning," she said, not smiling. "Can I have 10 shillings worth of flowers for the hospital? Chrysanthemums, I think. Not any white ones, please." "Have you seen Jane this morning?" Lucilla asked. "No, I have been out since 7 on business." Then Lucilla perceived that the gods did not intend this particular piece of work to be for Jane's doing. "Look here," she said, fumbling with the flowers. "I want to talk to you." "Yes?" said Miss Antrobus. "About the aunt," said Lucilla, teasing the wet blossoms. "Yes? Was there some mistake in the address you gave me last night?" "No," said Lucilla, "there isn't any mistake. There isn't any address. There isn't any aunt. It was all a silly trick. I was the aunt dressed up. Jane was looking for you to tell you, but—" Here, prompt as to a cue, Jane came pattering down the very stairs by which she had first tumbled into the garden room. "I say, Luce, I can't find her anywhere," she began. "Oh," she ended on a different note and stopped short, face to face with Miss Antrobus. "I was just telling Miss Antrobus— shut the door, Jane," said Lucilla, pale and determined, "about there not being any aunt really." "Yes," said Jane, "but I meant to tell you because it was really entirely my fault. My cousin didn't want to do it. She hated doing it. She only did it to please me, to get me out of a hole." "Your cousin dressed up to please you and impersonated an aunt who does not exist?" "Yes, I did," Lucilla affirmed. "I used to feel such a pig when you were so nice to me, but I didn't know how to get out of going on with it. I do hope you'll forgive us for playing such a trick on you." "But why?" said Miss Antrobus. "Why?" "Because," said Jane. "No, Lucy, it's no good, and I can't help it if it does offend people. This was why, Miss Antrobus. Mrs. Rochester came here being superior and patronizing, wanting to see our chaperone. She almost said you wouldn't come here unless there was some old lady. So I thought, if Mrs. Rochester wants old ladies, I daresay we can supply them. I was in an awful rage, and I said there was an Aunt Harriet, just to shut Mrs. Rochester up, and then of course there had to be one. And I'm very sorry if you're annoyed about it, but really I can't see that it's done anyone any harm. And if Mrs. Rochester hadn't come here interfering and hinting that we weren't capable of looking after our own affairs, it would never have happened." Miss Antrobus had sat down. Now she bent her head over the flower table. "Did Mrs. Rochester say anything about me? Anything special? Cards on the table," she said sharply, seeing that Lucilla hesitated. But Jane did not hesitate. "Yes, she did," she answered. "When she thought she'd got an aunt to say them to. She said that you and Mr. Rochester were secretly engaged and begged the aunt to give you opportunities of sweethearting and to warn us off. So now you know." Lucilla turned startled eyes on the speaker. How could Jane know? Miss Antrobus raised a brave but scarlet face. "Thank you," she said. "That is cards on the table. Now for mine. I used to be fond of Mrs. Rochester. When I was a girl I had a passing fancy for John Rochester, and Mrs. Rochester encouraged it. But the war knocked all that nonsense out of my head, and he never looked the same side of the road as I was. Never." "But how horrible of Mrs. Rochester," said Lucilla. "I didn't know there were people like that, out of books." "Oh, well, it seems there are, a few," said Miss Antrobus dryly. "She told me that her Jack had fallen into the toils of a designing girl, a sort of low-class siren, and asked me to come here and put a spoke in the siren's wheel. Be a rescue party, in fact. and for the sake of old times I agreed to come. Besides, I wanted to see a siren. But of course, when I saw you two, and when I saw John Rochester with you, I understood, well, that Mrs. Rochester was trying it on again. Only I couldn't quite make out the aunt. But surely aunts do happen in most families. An aunt was quite probable. Oh yes, but not an imitation aunt. I could not think why you were acting that farce. "Do you mean to say," cried Lucilla, all the actress in her outraged almost beyond endurance, "do you mean to say that you knew I wasn't a real aunt?" "Of course I did, almost from the first. But you went on being so nice to me. That was to try to make you do what you have done. Own up. And when we wouldn't, you tried frightening us. Well, wasn't it fair? A sort of tit for tat." Poof! How the atmosphere's cleared by a little plain speaking. "I say, you two girls, let's be friends, shall we? I believe we shall get on awfully well together now there are no pretences and misrepresentations between us." And as she smiled at them, holding out a hand to each, they saw for the first time that which Mr. Dix had described as a sort of radiant goodness shining from her face. "Yes, rather," they said. And Jane added, "It's most awfully decent of you not to be ratty with us for playing such a trick on you." "But," said Lucilla, struck by a sudden thought, "do you think the others spotted the false aunt?" "Oh, no," Miss Antrobus assured her. "Not one of them. You acted splendidly. I was the only one that had the least suspicion." That night Lucilla woke suddenly. Very wide awake she was. So wide awake that she knew it would be vain to thump the pillow and turn over. She had better read. Or better still write up her diary. The brown morocco volume with the shining lock and her name in gilt letters on it had been the guardian's present when she was 15. She had neglected it lately. True, many interesting things had happened. Things that would have impelled the diarist of 15, 16, 17 to pages of chronicle and comment. But there had been nothing which moved 19 to a record, under lock and key, until... Well, anyhow, Lucilla did now feel that she had neglected her diary too long. It was down in the bureau in the drawing-room. Well, she supposed she could fetch it. She lit her shaded candle, slipped into the silken blue kimono with the apple blossom embroidery on it, another of the guardian's presents, and, candle in hand, crept down the wide stairs. But as she went, the air from an open window blew out her candle, and then she saw below her a yellow streak of light from the drawing-room door. Someone else was up. At 3 in the morning? Jane looking for a book? Gladys looking for traces of secrets in her particular department of knowledge? An insomnolent P.G.? A burglar? Lucilla crept down the remaining stairs and laid an eye to the crack of the drawing-room door. And it was a burglar. A strange man sat at the bureau quietly going through the papers on it. A kit bag lay beside him on the floor, evidently full. And the silver candlesticks and inkstand and the silver Indian things off the mantelpiece, none of them there. Lucilla crept up the stairs again, fleet and noiseless as Diana in the chase, and as she went she thought, "Call Jane? No good, any more than I am. The servants? Worse than no good. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton? No, a woman might scream if you wakened her suddenly. Mr. Tombs? I think not. Bill Thornton? Yes, I think so." And she crept along the softly carpeted corridor towards the young man's room. "But you can't knock at his door," said Decorum to Lucilla, "because of warning the burglar. You'll have to go right in." "That will never do. It wouldn't be proper." "Don't be silly," said Lucilla to Decorum. "I've something else to think about than things being proper." And she turned the handle of Bill's door, which opened noiselessly. Not locked, thank goodness. The room was quite dark. But she knew where the bed lay and felt her way to it. Fortunately, she was one of those persons who do not lose their sense of direction in the dark. Presently she felt the edge of the bed against her knees and heard the quiet breathing of him who slept there. Did men scream if you waked them suddenly? Well, she must chance that. She reached out her hand to where she thought a shoulder should be, grasped an arm clad in thick silk, and whispered as she grasped it, "Hush!" Mr. Thornton did not scream, nor did he move. He answered her whisper with another. "What's up?" "It's me. It's Lucilla. There's a burglar." "Where?" "In the drawing room." "Right-o," he whispered. "Cut back to your room. It'll be all right." "Take care he doesn't shoot you," she said. If you can laugh in a whisper, Bill Thornton did it. "I've got a revolver," he said. "Don't you worry." Lucilla felt her way to the door, and she did go back to her own room, but only to get the poker. And she did this without rattling the fire irons. "I should make a good burglar myself," she thought. She waited in the darkness by the stairhead and perceived the Mr. Thornton who was Bill creeping down, silent as Mercury. Then she followed with her poker, feeling a heroine. She reached the drawing-room door in time to hear, "That's right. Any firearms?" "No," said a strange and husky voice. "Any more of you?" "No." "Empty that bag, and don't rattle the stuff fit to wake the dead." A faint rattling followed. "Now turn out your pockets." Fainter rattlings. Then, "What are you going to do with me, Governor?" "Kick you out," said Thornton's voice. "If you take my advice, you'll chuck this lay. You don't know your own silly business. A bare light, and the door left open? You deserve the stone jug." "I know I do," said the man, "but this ain't the trade I was brought up to." "What's your trade?" "Sign writer." "Can't you get a job?" "Oh, yes," said the man. "Course I can get a job. Jobs is going about waiting to be got, ain't they? Wish I was back in the trenches, I do. Or else out of it. I'd do myself in tonight if it wasn't for—" "Don't begin about the kids and the missus," said Thornton. "That's what you chaps always do when you're caught. Here, take that." His tone was so fierce that Lucilla cowered on the mat in the darkness, expecting the hard, soft sound of a blow. But what she heard was a gasp, and then, after the gasp, a pause, and then, "Well, if ever you gets into a hole, I hope someone'll be the gentleman to you as you've been to me tonight." "Cut all that," said Thornton. "You came in by the staircase window, I suppose?" "Yes, sir, up the ivy." "Well, I'll let you out. This way." They went out by the French window. Lucilla turned to go upstairs, but someone was coming down. A light at the top of the stairs. She backed out into the open doorway of the kitchen, and Mr. Tombs passed within a yard of her into the drawing-room. She heard Mr. Thornton's footstep on the gravel, and Mr. Tombs' voice. "Hallo, Thornton, what's up?" "Only a burglar," said Thornton. "I've just seen him out." "Let him off, eh?" "Oh, well," said Thornton, "you can't be too hard on a poor beggar like that. What's he to do? The very church itself says you may steal rather than starve." "Yes," said Tombs, "what is a chap to do?" "Let's have a cigar and you tell me all about it. Quite an adventure for quiet Cedar Court." "All right," said the Mr. Thornton who was called Bill. "I only hope we haven't roused the house. I'll get my cigar case." As he passed Lucilla's door, he breathed, "All right, he's gone." So he never knew that Lucilla had been prepared to defend him with the poker. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Lark by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The last chapter divides itself naturally, like an old-fashioned sermon, into 4 headings and a conclusion. And before entering on the first section, I must premise that the 7th of October was a day of days. A day when Spanish castles came thundering down to dust, when new Aladdin palaces reared their stately domes and minarets, as it were, between tea and dinner. A day when truths were told and secrets revealed. when new adventures entered on old enterprises, and when in fact the world of Cedar Court was caught up, shaken in a bag, and tumbled out again. Or if you prefer the image, fate, weary of the consistent good luck of Jane and Lucilla, gave a sharp jerk to the kaleidoscope, and behold, the entire pattern was transformed. First came the affair of the Thorntons. They had been out to a concert the night before, had said they might be late or might stay away all night. They had stayed away all night, nor did they return next morning. Mr. Tombs, on the other hand, contrary to his usual custom, did stay at home. He escorted Lucilla on her flower gatherings, and listened kindly to her wonders as to what had become of the Thorntons. "I hope they won't stay away 2 nights," said Lucilla. "We wanted to have another little dance." Mr. Tombs owned that dancing was delightful and asked for the first waltz. He stayed with Lucilla while she arranged flowers in the shop. It was Gladys's day off. Miss Antrobus devoted herself wholly to Jane, who found it interesting to explore the mind of a young woman so different from herself and Lucilla. "I wonder," Miss Antrobus said, after a long talk about the aims of art and about life being real, life being earnest, "I wonder whether you'd let the other cottage to me, the one Mr. Dix doesn't have." "Oh," said Jane, quite hurt by this sudden defection of a newfound friend and always satisfactory P.G. "Aren't you happy with us?" "I'm sure I should be very happy," said Miss Antrobus, "but one never knows what may turn up. And even if I stayed here I should like to have the cottage, and to pay rent for it, of course." "Would 30 shillings a week?" "I should think so," said Jane forlornly, "but your going will rather break up the happy home, won't it?" "How nice of you to say that, but it won't really. And I want to go in for gardening, and living the simple life." Meeting just before luncheon, Jane and Lucilla compared notes. "I feel as if I were being chaperoned by Mr. Tombs," said Lucilla. "You're right," said Jane, with sudden conviction. "That's what Miss Antrobus has been doing to me." They were all together in the drawing-room, and the Thorntons still hadn't come when the blow fell. Forbes, looking thoroughly scandalized, announced, "The police inspector, please, ma'am, to see the lady of the house." And before she could back out of the room, the inspector had squeezed himself past her into it. "Sorry to inconvenience you, miss," he said, breathing heavily, "but from information received I understand there's 3 parties under the name of Thornton living here." "Yes," said Jane. "Well, miss, the fact is they're wanted. I should wish to break it gently, but the fact is there have been a lot of burglaries, and I'm very sorry it should happen to friends of yours, but I'm sure you're innocent as the lamb unborn, miss." "Of course we are," said Lucilla impatiently, "and so are the Thorntons. There was a burglar here a few days ago, but he didn't take anything, and Mr. Thornton let him go." "That is so, Inspector." Mr. Tombs confirmed the statement, while Jane looked reproachful and Miss Antrobus sympathetic. "That may be, sir," said the policeman. "Birds of a feather would naturally assist each other, even when swell cracksmen, as these Thorntons certainly are. Very sorry for unpleasantness, miss, but I've got the warrants both for arrest and search." "They aren't here," said Jane. "But their apartments are," said the large policeman. "Perhaps the gentleman would show us the way? One room kept locked? I dare say we shall find a way to deal with that. Excuse me, ladies." Well, there was no doubt about it. The charming Thorntons, so kind, so considerate, so well-read, so accomplished, had been just burglars. Well, not just burglars, they had been other things as well, as Jane and Lucilla insisted on remembering. They had used the cases of cello and violin and double bass to carry their booty into the house, and the locked room to conceal it in. The police had quite a rich harvest in the things the Thorntons had had to leave behind. They had not been able to take away all their plunder, but they had taken themselves away, quite successfully, to the secret joy of Lucilla and Jane. "But it's horrible," said Lucilla to Mr. Tombs, pacing distracted in the garden. "I shall never believe in anyone again. And what will become of them? And what will become of them? They're sure to be caught sometime, even if they get away safely this time." "Well," said Mr. Tombs, pulling his moustache, "the fact is— Can you keep a secret?" "Yes, if I want to," said Lucilla, making a sound distinction. "Well, I don't think they will be caught. They've got enough money to get away by different routes, and they're frightfully clever at disguises. They'll meet again in Rhodesia, and I've given them a letter to a chap I know. He'll put them into something. They'll be all right." Lucilla turned and caught him by the arms just above the elbow. "You're an angel," she said, shaking him gently. "I didn't know men could be so sensible. Why, any girl could see they weren't the sort of people to be burglars unless they couldn't possibly help it. Why, we might any of us have been driven to it, only we have been so lucky." "Yes," said Mr. Tombs, "that's what I said to myself. There but for the grace of God goes little Arthur." He took off the blue spectacles and looked at her. "Why, you're that chauffeur," said Lucilla, and she sat down suddenly on a stump. "I am," said he, "and I am also Arthur Panton, your defaulting trustee and guilty guardian. That's a secret you really must keep. I made quite a lot of money in a very short time in South Africa, and I'm going back to make some more. But I had to come and see that you were all right. I had you both so horribly on my conscience. But now I see that you are all right. I must be off, to make some more money, so as to pay all the people I owe money to and be something like an honest chap again." "I won't tell anyone, not even Jane," said Lucilla earnestly. "Mind you don't," said he. "And now I'm off. My bag is packed and my bark is on the shore, and the taxi is on its way to fetch me away from Cedar Court and from you. Haven't you a kind word to say to me before I go?" Lucilla tried vainly for a kind word. "I think you look awfully nice without your spectacles," was the best she could do. "I shall look much nicer when I come back to whitewash myself. Pay all my creditors, you know. You'll be glad to see me then?" "Oh, yes," said Lucilla. "Then goodbye." "Guardians don't count," said Mr. Tombs. And the next moment Lucilla was watching his tweed back disappearing in the shrubbery and realizing that she had again been kissed. And this time not on her hand. That was thirdly. Fourthly occurred after a breathless tea, where the Thorntons had been talked over very gently, and Mr. Tombs' sudden departure had been attributed by Miss Antrobus to an objection, natural in a shy man, to being mixed up with such a shady business as a house where burglars were harboured. Presently Miss Antrobus withdrew to inspect the cottage. Lucilla and Jane had hardly exchanged 3 words before John Rochester burst in upon them with "Fourthly." And Fourthly really was a facer. He came in with a letter in his hand, and he did not say "Good afternoon" or "How do you do?" or any of the things that one does say when there is nothing the matter. He was very pale. Not at all a becoming pallor, Lucilla thought. And he said straight away, like that, "Look here, that uncle of mine—" "Not dead?" said Jane. "No, I wish he— No, of course I don't mean that. But he oughtn't to be at large. At least he oughtn't to be trusted with houses. He doesn't know when they're well off." "He's going to turn us out," said Jane. "Oh, I knew it was all too good to last. I told Lucy so, didn't I, Lucy?" "Only out of Cedar Court," said Rochester. "Just the house. You can still have the garden and the garden room and the stables and cottages. He's lent the house now to a Theosophist Brotherhood. It's exactly like him. And he's somewhere in Tibet himself, so I can't reason with him." "Oh, well," said Jane slowly, "we've had a lovely time. We shall have to go back to Hope Cottage, that's all. I suppose it will be a lark going back to the dear little house." She cast one glance round the room and fled, to collapse in tears on the stairs. Lucilla remained. "I think it's a great deal too bad," she said. "Why let us have it at all?" "Ah, why?" said Rochester. "But all's not lost yet. I believe really you'll do better without the paying guests. They're such an awful risk, aren't they? I say, do be an angel and send Jane to the library for something. I must see her alone. Do. But when she found Jane in tears on the stairs, it seemed better to Lucilla that Mr. Rochester himself should persuade her to the library if he wanted her there. Lucilla herself trailed miserably after Miss Antrobus. Sympathy from someone she must have. About Cedar Court. Nobody wanted Lucilla in libraries. The two who might have wanted her had both gone over the seas, and... Hi-ho. But it was a cold world. But Miss Antrobus was full of plans as well as of sympathy. The three girls could all live in the cottage. It would be great fun, and not nearly so trying to the nerves as the responsibility of a big house. They sat on the edge of the sink in the bare kitchen of the large cottage and laid the foundation of sober Spanish cottages. And Rochester had taken Jane's wet hands and pulled them from her face and put his arm round her and taken her into the library and shut the door. Jane instantly buried her face against a leather sofa cushion. "Don't cry, Jane," he said. "Don't cry. Don't. You haven't really lost anything that matters. You've got Lucilla, and you've got Gladys, and you've got Dix, the super gardener, and Miss Antrobus, who really isn't half a bad sort. And you've got me, Jane, if you'll have me." "Oh, don't," said Jane, with her face in the sofa cushion. "Oh, I wish you wouldn't. Don't you like me to hold your poor little cold hands? But let me hold them just a minute, Jane. You know when you tried that charm on St. John's Eve, and lighted the candles, and wore the wreath of yellow flowers, and said the spell, and said, 'Let me now my true love see'?" "Yes," said Jane, suddenly sitting up and looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I suppose Lucilla's been chattering, silly goose. What did you see?" "Never mind," said Jane. "No, but do tell me, darling Jane." "I saw you," said Jane, at bay. "And that's why I can't let you hold my hands or hold my hands. I can't have anything to do with you. It's not right. It's uncanny. It says in the Bible, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.' It was witchcraft, and I saw your face. I don't know how you guessed it, but I did see you. A sort of vision of you. Your face seemed to be suspended about a yard from the ground. The rest of you wasn't there. And I've thought about it, and of course it was magic. And most awfully wrong. And if I were to let you call me Jane and all that, it would be going on with the wrongness. There wasn't any magic at all about it," he said slowly. "You saw me because I was there, stooping down, peering through the bushes to see what the lights were at that hour in that lonely wood. It was just flesh and blood me, not a vision at all. It wasn't magic, but accident. The most blessed accident that ever... Really? Truly? It wasn't a vision? You were there? Your real self?" "My real self," said Rochester. "Oh dear," said Jane on a deep breath of relief. "How perfectly splendid. I do wish I'd known before, though." She faced him with her own inimitable look of elfish mischief and innocent candour. "Do you mean— oh, Jane, I may call you Jane?" "Yes, if you want to." "And I may hold your hands?" "You've been holding them all the time," said Jane. "And you?" "Don't ask any more questions," she said, jumping up. "Let me go and wash my face and do my hair. Jane, do you love me?" You'll marry me?" "Not for ever so long," said Jane. "I've got to make my way in the world first." She got her hands away and reached the door, but he caught her there. "Jane, darling, just one, only one." "Not with this dirty face," said Jane firmly. "Oh, I say, which is the secret door?" "The secret door? Oh, we've got that open now." "And this door too," said Jane, opening it, and fled. At the stair foot she collided with Lucilla, who looked from her to Rochester and said, "Oh!" "Yes," said Rochester. End of chapter 31. End of the Lark by E. Nesbit.